In the vast expanse of human existence, where the pursuit of meaning and the weight of dissatisfaction entwine in a never-ending dance of light and shadow, emerges a profound text that sheds light on the darkest recesses of the soul. The Maze of Misery by Bertrand Russell is a literary journey into the most perplexing aspects of our condition, a labyrinth where every twist uncovers new dimensions of the sorrow and disillusionment that pervade the human experience. From the opening chapter, we are thrust into an emotional storm where the clarity of reason clashes with the chaos of passion. With sharp intellect and masterful prose, Russell leads us through fractured reflections of our deepest fears, doubts, and unspoken desires. This intellectual journey is more than a study of unhappiness. It becomes a passage into the heart of our inner turmoil, encouraging us to examine not only the external forces that plague us, but also the unseen wounds we carry within. The Maze of Misery is far more than a philosophical exploration. It's a challenge to face our inner demons and dismantle the myths surrounding happiness. Through a powerful blend of introspective thought and poetic expression, Russell offers us a compass to navigate the intricate corridors of our own minds, illuminating a path toward a fuller understanding of what it means to live meaningfully, despite the ever-present labyrinths of misery that encircle us. Causes of Misery, Chapter 1. What makes people unhappy? Animals are happier as long as they have health and sufficient means to feed themselves. Humans should also be happy with these resources, but this is not the case in the vast majority of situations. If you are unhappy yourself, you will likely be willing to admit that you are not exceptional in this regard. But if you are happy, ask yourself how many of your friends are. Once you have examined your friends, learn the art of reading faces. Be receptive to the moods of those you encounter throughout an ordinary day. A mark on each face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of pain. Blake says that although the types are different, you will find that misery is everywhere. Stand on a busy street during working hours, in a main street on the weekend, or at a dance party. Empty your mind of your own ego and let the personalities of the strangers around you wash over you, one by one. You will then find that each of these different crowds has its own problems. In the crowded workplaces, you will see excessive anxiety, concentration, dyspepsia, a lack of interest in anything other than struggle, an inability to play, and a consciousness of one's peers. On a main street on the weekend, you will see men and women all comfortably settled, some very wealthy, engaged in the pursuit of pleasure. This concern is shared by all at a tremendous speed, that of the slowest car in the procession. It is impossible to see the road for the cars or the landscape, as looking to the side would cause an accident. All the occupants of the cars are absorbed by the desire to overtake other cars, which they cannot do due to the crowd. If their minds divert from this concern, as will occasionally happen to those who are not driving, an indescribable boredom overwhelms them and manifests itself on their features as trivial discontent. From time to time, a car filled with people of color will show genuine joy, but this will provoke outrage because of their erratic behavior and will end up in the hands of the police due to an accident, as pleasure during holidays is illegal. Alternatively, observe people at a gay party. All come determined to be happy with the grim resolve with which one decides not to make a scene at the dentist. It is argued that drinks and caresses are the gateways to joy, so people quickly get drunk and try not to realize how much their partner disgusts them. After a sufficient amount of alcohol, men begin to cry and lament their unworthiness towards their mother's devotion. All that alcohol does for them is release the sense of sin that reason represses during healthier moments. The causes of these various types of misery lie partly in the social system and in individual psychology, which is, of course, largely a product of the social system. I have previously written about the necessary changes in the social system to promote happiness, about the abolition of war, economic exploitation, education in cruelty and fear. It is not my intention to discuss in this volume the means to prevent war, as such a system is a vital necessity for our civilization. But no such system stands a chance as long as men are so unhappy that mutual extermination seems less terrible to them than the continuous resistance to the light of day. Avoiding the concern of poverty is necessary so that the benefits of mechanical production reach to some extent those who need it most. But what good does it do to make everyone rich if the rich themselves are miserable? Education in cruelty and fear is bad, but it cannot be imparted by those who are themselves slaves to these passions. These considerations lead us to the problem of the individual. What can a woman or a man do here and now, amidst our nostalgic society, to attain happiness for themselves? To address this problem, I will limit my attention to those who are not subjected to any external cause of external misery. I will assume a sufficient income to ensure food and housing, sufficient health to allow for ordinary physical activities, and I will not take into account great catastrophes like the loss of all children or public misfortunes. There are things to say about such matters, and they are important, but they belong to a different order of things than those I wish to address. My aim is to suggest a remedy for the daily misery suffered by most people among civilized countries, which is all the more unbearable as it has no obvious external cause. It seems inevitable. I believe that this misery is largely due to ethical addictions and erroneous habits of life, which lead to the destruction of that natural enthusiasm and appetite for possible things upon which ultimately all happiness depends, whether for humans or animals. These are questions that are within the reach of the individual, and I propose to suggest the change through which their happiness, given average good fortune, can be achieved. Perhaps the best introduction to the philosophy I wish to defend is a few autobiographical words. I was not born happy. As a child, my favorite hymn was "Weary of the world and burdened by my sin." At the age of 5, I reflected that if I reached 70 years, I would have only endured a quarter of my life thus far, and I felt that the long boredom awaiting me was almost unbearable. In my teenage years, I hated life and was continually on the verge of suicide, but my desire to know more in mathematics held me back. Now, on the contrary, I enjoy life. I could almost say that each passing year I enjoy it more. This is partly due to having discovered what I desired most, and gradually acquiring many of those things, partly due to having succeeded in dismissing certain objects of desire, such as the acquisition of undeniable knowledge about something I found essentially inaccessible, but largely due to a progressively reduced concern for oneself. Like others who have received a Puritan education, I used to meditate on my sins, my follies, and my faults, and I found myself a miserable specimen. Gradually, I learned to be different from myself and to focus my attention increasingly on external objects. The state of the world, various branches of knowledge, individuals for whom I felt affection, external interests. Certainly these interests each bring their own possibility of pain. The world may be plunged into war. Knowledge may be limited in one direction. Friends may die. But these pains do not destroy the essential quality of life as those that arise from self-disgust do. Every external interest inspires an activity that, as long as the interest remains vivid, is a complete remedy against boredom. Self-interest, on the other hand, leads to no kind of progressive activity. It may lead to keeping a journal, submitting to psychoanalysis, or perhaps becoming a monk. But the monk will only be happy when the routine of the monastery makes him forget his own soul. The happiness he attributes to religion could have been obtained by becoming a street sweeper, as long as he was obliged to continue being one. External discipline is the only path to happiness for those whose confinement is too deep to be cured otherwise. Confinement comes in several types. We can consider the sinner, the narcissist, and the megalomaniac as the three most common types. When I speak of the sinner, I do not refer to the man who commits sins, as sins are committed by anyone or no one according to our definition of the word. I refer to the man who is absorbed by the consciousness of sin. This man is frequently prey to his own disapproval, which he interprets, if he is religious, as God's disapproval. He has an idealized image of himself, of what he thinks he ought to be, which is in constant conflict with his knowledge of himself as he is. In his conscious thought, he has long rejected the maxims he was taught in childhood. His sense of sin may be buried deep in his unconscious and only manifest when he is drunk or asleep. However, this may be enough to take the taste out of everything. Deep down, he continues to accept all the prohibitions that were taught to him in childhood. Swearing is bad, drinking is bad, ordinary commercial cunning is bad, and above all, sex is bad. Of course, he refrains from none of these pleasures, but all are poisoned by this feeling that they degrade him. The only pleasure he desires with all his soul is that of being caressed with approval by his mother, which he remembers having experienced in his childhood. When this pleasure is no longer within his reach, he feels that nothing matters. He then decides to sin deeply. When he falls in love, he seeks maternal tenderness but cannot accept it because, due to the maternal image, he respects no woman with whom he has sexual relations. Then, in his disappointment, he becomes cruel, repents of his cruelty, and begins the gloomy cycle of imagined sin and real remorse. This is the psychology of many reprobates. Apparently tough, what leads them astray is the devotion to an inaccessible object, in this case, the mother or the substance of the mother, combined with an inclination toward a ridiculous ethical code. Liberation from the tyranny of early beliefs and affects is the first step toward happiness for these victims of maternal virtue. Narcissism is, in a sense, the reverse of the usual sense of sin. It consists of the habit of admiring oneself and desiring to be admired, which to a certain extent is, of course, normal and should not be lamented. It is only in its excesses that it becomes a serious evil. In many women, especially in wealthy circles, the ability to feel love completely dries up and is replaced by a powerful desire for all men to love them. When such a woman is certain that a man loves her, she no longer has any use for him. The same goes, although less frequently, for men. The example is that of the classical hero of the novel Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which describes the romantic adventures of French aristocrats just before the Revolution. When vanity is pushed to this extent, there is no authentic interest in anything else, which means that no real satisfaction can be obtained from love. Other interests fail with more noise. A narcissist, for example, inspired by the homage paid to great painters, may become an art student, but as painting is for him merely a means to achieve an end, the technique never becomes interesting, and no subject can be seen other than in relation to the self. The result is failure and disappointment with ridicule instead of the expected adulation. The same goes for novelists whose novels always idealize their heroines. Any serious success in work depends on a genuine interest in the material with which the work deals. The tragedy of a successful politician is the progressive situation of narcissism through interest in the community and the measures he advocates. A man who is only interested in himself is not admirable and does not feel like one. Consequently, a man whose only concern is that the world admires him is unlikely to achieve his goal. Even if he does succeed, he will not be completely happy, as human instinct is never entirely egocentric. The narcissist has artificially limited himself, just like the man dominated by a sense of sin. The primitive man could take pride in being a good hunter, but he also enjoyed the activity of hunting. Vanity, when it exceeds a certain threshold, kills pleasure in any activity and inevitably leads to apathy and boredom. Its source is often distrust, and its cure lies in the development of self-respect, which can only be achieved through successful activity inspired by objective interests. The megalomaniac differs from the narcissist in that he wishes to be powerful rather than lovable and seeks to be feared rather than loved. This type includes many madmen and most of the great men in history. The love of power, like vanity, is a powerful element in normal human nature, and as such, must be accepted. It only becomes deplorable when it is excessive and associated with an insufficient sense of reality. When this occurs, a man becomes unhappy or mad, if not both at once. The madman who believes he is a king may, in a sense, be happy, but his happiness is not of the type that any sane person would envy. Alexander the Great was psychologically of the same type as this madman. Although he possessed the talent to achieve the madman's dream, he could not realize his own dream, which expanded as his successes grew. When the greatest conqueror known to fame decided he was a god, he was a happy man. His drunkenness, his rages, his indifference to women, and his divine pretensions suggest that he was not. There is no ultimate satisfaction in cultivating one element of human nature at the expense of all others, nor in viewing the entire world as raw material for the magnificence of one's own ego. In general, the megalomaniac, whether truly mad or simply nominally so, is the product of excessive humiliation. Napoleon suffered in school from the inferiority of his classmates, who were rich aristocrats while he was a miserable scholarship student. When he permitted the return of the émigrés, he had the satisfaction of seeing his former schoolmates bow before him. What joy! However, this led him to desire to obtain a similar satisfaction at the expense of the Tsar, which led him to St. Helena. Given that no man can be omnipotent, A life entirely dominated by the love of power cannot fail to encounter insurmountable obstacles sooner or later. The knowledge that this is the case can only be avoided by a form of madness. Although, if a man is sufficiently great, he can imprison or execute those who point the finger at him, the repressiveness, both political and psychoanalytic, go hand in hand. Where psychoanalytic repression takes place in marked form, there is no real happiness. Power maintained within its own limits can greatly contribute to happiness, but as the sole aim of life, it leads to inner disaster, if not outer. The psychological causes of unhappiness are many and varied, but they all have something in common. The typically unhappy man is one who, having been deprived in his youth of all normal satisfaction, comes to value this type of satisfaction more than any other, and gives his life a one-sided direction, with a rather excessive emphasis on achievement compared to the activities related to it. However, there is a further development that is very common nowadays. A man may feel so completely frustrated that he seeks no form of satisfaction, only distraction and forgetfulness. He then becomes a hedonist, seeking to make life bearable by becoming less alive. Intoxication, for example, is a temporary suicide, as the happiness it provides is simply negative, a momentary cessation of misfortune. The narcissist and the megalomaniac believe that happiness is possible, although they adopt erroneous means to achieve it. But the man who seeks intoxication in any form has given up hope, except regarding forgetfulness. In his case, the first thing to do is to persuade him that happiness is desirable. Men who are unhappy, like those who sleep poorly, are often proud of it. Perhaps their pride is like that of the fox who has lost its tail. If that is the case, the way to heal them is to show them how they can grow back a new tail. Very few men, I believe, will deliberately choose unhappiness if they see a way to be happy. I do not deny that such men exist, but they are not numerous enough to be significant. Therefore, I will assume that listeners prefer to be happy rather than unhappy. I do not know if I will be able to help them fulfill this desire, but in any case, the effort cannot be harmful. Unhappiness, ironically, goes hand in hand with common ideas today, as it has in many other periods of world history. It is assumed that those who are wise have seen through all the enthusiasms of previous times and have become aware that there is nothing else for which to live. The men who hold this view are truly unhappy, but they are proud of their unhappiness, which they attribute to the nature of the universe and consider it the only rational attitude for an enlightened man. The pride in their unhappiness makes less sophisticated people suspect its authenticity, as they think that the man who takes pleasure in being unhappy is not really so. This view is too simplistic, no doubt. There is a slight compensation with the feeling of superiority and insight that these sufferers possess. But this is not enough to compensate for the loss of simpler pleasures. I do not believe myself that there is a superior rationality in being unhappy. The wise man will be as happy as circumstances allow, and if he finds the contemplation of the universe painful beyond a certain point, he will contemplate something else instead. This is what I wish to demonstrate in the present chapter. I want to convince the audience that, regardless of the arguments, reason does not hinder happiness. Moreover, I am convinced that those who sincerely attribute their woes to their opinions about the universe are putting the cart before the horse. The truth is that they are unhappy for a reason of which they are not aware, and this unhappiness leads them to focus on the least pleasant aspects of the world in which they live. For modern Americans, the perspective I wish to consider has been articulated by Mr. Joseph Good Crash in a book titled The Modern Temperament. For the generation of our grandparents, it was expressed by Byron. Throughout all time, it has been stated by the author of Ecclesiastes. Mr. Crash argues that demonstration is a lost cause and that there is no place for us in the natural universe. Nevertheless, we do not regret being human. We prefer to die as men rather than live as animals. Byron states that there is no joy in the world that can compare to that which disappears when the brilliance of early thought transforms into a depressing dullness of feelings. The author of Ecclesiastes says, "Therefore I prefer the dead who are already dead rather than the living who are still alive." These three pessimists reach their grim conclusions after revisiting the pleasures of life. Mr. Crash lived in the most intellectual circles of New York. Byron navigated the world and had countless love affairs, and the author of Ecclesiastes was even more varied in his quest for pleasures. He tasted wine, music, and everything that came his way, and built ponds, aqueducts, servants' maids, and born servants at home. Even under these circumstances, his wisdom did not leave him. However, he saw that everything was vanity. I have given my heart to know wisdom, madness, and folly. Thus I perceive that this too is vexation of spirit, for in wisdom there is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. His wisdom seems to have troubled him, as did his fruitless efforts to rid himself of it. He then says in his heart, I will now make you experience joy, so rejoice in pleasure. But behold, this too is vanity. Nevertheless, his wisdom remained with him. Then I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it happens to me. Why then am I more wise? And I said in my heart that this too was vanity. He then abhors life, because the work done under the sun seems burdensome to him, since everything is vanity and vexation of spirit. It is fortunate for writers that people no longer read what was written long ago, for if they did, they would arrive at the conclusion that, no matter how important the ponds of water are, the creation of new books is certainly vanity. If we can demonstrate that the doctrine of Ecclesiastes is not the only one presented to a wise man, we need not concern ourselves with later expressions of the same kind of arguments. We must distinguish between a state of mind and its intellectual expression. One cannot argue with a state of mind. It can be modified by a happy event or a change in our physical condition, but not by arguments. I myself have often experienced a state of mind where I felt that everything was vanity. I emerged from this state not through philosophy, but through an urgent need for action. If your child is sick, you may be unhappy, but you will not feel that everything is vanity. You will feel that the child's recovery is a matter to address, regardless of whether there is any ultimate value in human life. A rich man may feel, and often does, that everything is vanity. But if he loses his money, he would feel that his next meal is not vanity at all. This feeling arises from an overly easy satisfaction of natural needs. The human animal, like others, is suited for a certain struggle for life, and when, through great wealth, Homo sapiens can satisfy all his whims without effort, the simple absence of effort in his life removes an essential ingredient of happiness. The man who acquires things for which he feels only a moderate desire concludes that the fulfillment of desire does not bring happiness. If he has a philosophical disposition, he concludes that human life is essentially miserable, for the man who has everything he wants remains unhappy. He forgets that the lack of certain desired things is an indispensable part of happiness. So far for the state of mind. However, there are also intellectual arguments in Ecclesiastes. The rivers run into the sea, but the sea is not full. There is nothing new under the sun. There is no remembrance of former things. I hate all the work that I have done under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. If one were to try to present these arguments in the style of a modern philosopher, one would arrive at something like this. Man toils perpetually, and matter is in perpetual motion, but nothing remains. Although the new that comes after is not at all different from the old, a man dies and his heir gathers the fruits of his labor. The rivers run into the sea, but their waters cannot remain there, again and again in an endless and purposeless cycle. Men and things are born and die without improvement, without permanent achievement, day after day, year after year. The rivers, even if they were wise, would not stay in the same place. Solomon, if he were wise, would not plant fruit trees for his son to benefit from. But in another state of mind, all of this seems so different. There is nothing new under the sun. What can be said about skyscrapers, airplanes, and politicians' speeches? What did Solomon know of these things? If he had been able to listen to the Queen of Sheba's speech to her subjects upon her return from her domains, it would not have consoled him among his useful trees and ponds. If he had been able to consult a press agenda to see what newspapers said about the beauty of his architecture, the comforts of his palace, and the discomforts of the wise rivals who discussed with him, he might still have continued to say that there is nothing new under the sun. It is possible that these things would not have completely eased his mind, but they should have given him a new expression. In fact, one of Mr. Crash's complaints about our time is that there are many new things under the sun. If the absence or presence of novelty is equally tiresome, it seems that neither can be the true cause of despair. Let us also consider the fact that all rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Thus, the place from which the rivers come is where they return, which is seen as a reason for pessimism. This assumes that journeys are unpleasant. People go to spas in the summer but return to where they came from. This does not prove that it is useless to go to spas in the summer. If the waters had feelings, they would likely enjoy the adventurous cycle in the manner of Shelley's cloud. Regarding the pain of leaving things to the air, this is a question that can be viewed from two perspectives. From the air's point of view, it is clearly less disastrous. The fact that all things pass away in themselves is not a reason for pessimism. If worse things were to happen, that would be a reason. But if this occurs alongside better things, it is a reason for optimism. What should we think if, as you argue, Solomon saw exactly the same things? Does that not make the entire process completely pointless? Not necessarily. Unless the different stages of the cycle are painful in themselves, the habit of looking to the future and thinking that all the meaning of the present lies in what we are going to produce is harmful. There can be no value in the whole if there is no value in the parts. Life should not be conceived according to the analogy of a melodrama where the hero and heroine go through incredible misfortunes compensated by a happy ending. I live and have my day. My son lives and has his day, and his son in turn has his. What is to be made of all this to turn it into a tragedy? On the contrary, if I were to live forever, the joys of life would inevitably lose their flavor. As things are, they remain perpetually fresh. I have warmed my two hands by the fire of life. It goes out and I am ready to leave. This attitude is as rational as the indignations faced with death. Thus, if states of mind were decided by reason, there would be as many reasons for joy as for despair. Ecclesiastes is tragic. Mr. Crash's modern temperament is pathetic. Mr. Crash is truly sad because the old medieval certainties have collapsed, along with some more recent ones. As for this unhappy present time, it is said to be haunted by the ghosts of a dead world, and that it does not yet feel at home in its own. Its state is not different from that of the adolescent who has not yet learned to orient herself without reference to the mythology in which her childhood was spent. This assertion is entirely correct when applied to a certain sector of intellectuals, those who, having received a literary education, can know nothing of the modern world, and who were taught throughout their youth to base their beliefs on emotion, cannot detach themselves from that childish desire for security and protection that the world of science cannot fulfill. Mr. Crash, like most literati, is obsessed with the idea that science has not kept its promises. He certainly does not tell us what those promises were, but he seems to think that 60 years ago, men like Darwin and Huxley expected something from science that it did not deliver. I believe this is a deception, fomented by those writers and clerics who do not wish their specialties to be regarded as worthless. That the world contains many pessimists at the moment is true. There have always been many pessimists when many people have seen their incomes diminish. It is true that Mr. Crash is American, and that American incomes have generally increased with the war, but throughout the European continent, the intellectual classes have suffered terribly, while the war itself gives a feeling of instability to all. These social causes have much more to do with the state of mind of an era than with its theory about the nature of the world. Few times have been more despairing than the 13th century, although the faith that Mr. Crash laments so much was then firmly upheld by all except the emperor and a few great Italian nobles. Thus, Roger Bacon says, "For in these days there are more sins than in any other past age, and sin is incompatible with wisdom." Let us examine all the conditions of the world and consider them diligently. Everywhere we find unlimited corruption, primarily at the head of society, as a dishonor to the entire court. Greed is the master of all. If this is so at the head, how is it among the members? Let us see how the prelates pursue money and neglect the cure of souls. Let us consider the religious orders. I exclude none of what I say. Let us see how far each has fallen from his proper state, and the new orders of monks are already horrifically deteriorated from their first dignity. The entire clergy is engaged in pride, lust, and avarice, and wherever clerics gather, such as in Paris and Oxford, they scandalize everyone with their wars, disputes, and other vices, whether by the right way or the wrong, as long as each can satisfy his lust. Regarding the pagan sages of antiquity, he says their lives were by far better than ours, both in terms of decadence and disdain for the world with all its pleasures, wealth, and honors. All men can read in the works of Aristotle, Seneca, Cicero, Avicenna, Alfarabi, Plato, Socrates, and others. Thus they have reached the secrets of wisdom and discovered all knowledge. Roger Bacon's opinion was that of all his literary contemporaries, none of whom appreciated the time in which he found himself. I do not believe for a moment that this pessimism has a metaphysical cause. Its causes were war, poverty, and violence. One of the most pathetic chapters of Mr. Crash deals with the theme of love. It seems that the Victorians held it in high esteem, but we, with our modern sophistication, have come to see through it. For the most skeptical of the Victorians, love filled some of the functions of the God they had lost. Faced with it, many of the hardest in society temporarily became mystical. They found themselves in the presence of something that awakened in them a sense of reverence that nothing else evoked, something to which they felt even in the depths of their being, an undeniable loyalty. For them, love, like God, demanded all sacrifices, but like him, it also rewarded the believer by investing all the phenomena of life with an even deeper meaning. We have become more accustomed than they to a godless universe, but we have not yet grown accustomed to a universe without love, and it is only when we achieve that we will understand what atheism truly means. It is curious to see how different the Victorian era appears to the youth of our time compared to how it seemed when one lived in it. I remember two old ladies, both typical of certain aspects of the time, whom I knew well in my youth. One was puritanical, the other Voltairian. The former lamented that so much poetry dealt with love, which she found to be a rather uninteresting subject. The latter commented, "No one can say anything against me, but I always say that breaking the seventh commandment is no worse than breaking the sixth, because in either case it requires the consent of the other party." Neither of these viewpoints resembles those of Mr. Crash, who is typically Victorian. His ideas clearly derive from certain writers who were not at all in harmony with their environment. The best example, I suppose, is Robert Browning. However, I cannot help but think that the love as conceived by Browning is somewhat outdated. Thank God the most petty of his creatures boasts of having two souls, one to face the world, the other to show to a woman when he loves her. This implies that combativeness is the only possible attitude towards the world in general. Why? Because the world is cruel, Browning would say, because it does not accept you according to your own evaluation. Should we say that a couple can form, like the Brownings, a society of mutual admiration? It is very pleasant to have someone who is sure to praise your work, whether it deserves it or not. And Browning must have felt a refined and virile man, as when he denounced Fitzgerald in unmeasured terms for daring not to admire Aurora Leigh. It does not seem to me that the complete suspension of critical faculties by both parties is truly admirable. It is linked to fear and the desire to find a refuge against the cold blasts of impartial criticism. Many old bachelors learn to find the same satisfaction from their own fireside. I have lived too long in the Victorian era to be modern by Mr. Crash's standards. I have not lost my belief in love at all, but the type of love I can believe in is not the adventurous and open one that the Victorians admired. And although it imparts knowledge of good, it does not involve the forgetfulness of evil, nor does it claim to be sanctified or holy. Attributing these qualities to the type of love admired was a consequence of the sexual taboo. The Victorian was deeply convinced that most sex is bad and had to assign exaggerated adjectives to the type that could prove it. There was more thirst for sex at that time than there is today, and this undoubtedly led people to exaggerate the importance of sex, as ascetics have always done. Currently, we are going through a somewhat confusing period where many people have abandoned the old norms without acquiring new ones. This leads them to various problems, and as their innocence still believes in the old norms, the problems, when they arise, produce despair, remorse, and unease. I do not believe that the number of people to whom this happens is very large, but they are among the loudest in our time. I think that if we compared the average of well-established young people today with those of the Victorian era, we would find that there is today much more happiness in relation to love and much more true closeness in the value of love compared to 60 years ago. The reasons that lead some people to discomfort are linked to the tyranny of ancient ideals over the unconscious and the absence of a rational ethic allowing people to regulate their behavior. The remedy does not lie in lamenting and yearning for the past, but in a braver acceptance of the modern perspective and in the determination to uproot the nominally rejected superstitions from all their dark corners. It is not easy to succinctly explain why love is valued, but I will try. Love must be valued in the first place because, although it is not the greatest of goods, it is essential for all others as a source of pleasure in itself. Those who say that your sweet is bitter when your rich fruit is such that nothing can be sweeter cause you a lot of harm. The anonymous author of these lines was not seeking a solution for atheism or a key to the universe. He was simply having fun. Love is not only a source of pleasure, but its absence is also a source of pain. Secondly, love must be valued because it magnifies all the best pleasures, like music, the sunrise over the mountains, and the sea under the full moon. A man who has never enjoyed beautiful things in the company of a woman he has loved has not fully experienced the magical power of these things. Once again, love is capable of breaking the hard shell of the ego, as it is a form of biological cooperation in which each person's emotions are necessary to fulfill the instinctive goals of the other. Throughout history, there have been various solitary philosophies, some very noble, others less so. The Stoics and the early Christians believed that man could achieve the greatest good of which he is capable in human life by his own will, or in any case without human help. Others considered power to be the purpose of life, while others still regarded mere personal pleasure as such. All these solitary philosophies, in the sense that the good is supposed to be something achievable in each person separately, and not just in a more or less large society of people, are, in my opinion, false, not only in ethical theory, but also as expressions of the best part of our instincts. Man depends on cooperation, and nature provides him with an instinctive apparatus that can engender the necessary friendship for that cooperation. Love is the first and most common form of emotion that leads to cooperation. Those who have experienced love with some intensity will not settle for a philosophy that assumes their greatest good is independent of the loved one. In this sense, parental feeling is even more powerful, but parental feeling at its best is the result of parental love. I do not claim that love in its highest form is common, but I maintain that it has a value in its highest form that is not touched by skepticism, although skeptics unable to appreciate this may falsely attribute their incapacity to their skepticism. True love is a lasting fire in the spirit, always ardent, never sick, never dead, never cold in itself, never past. I will now turn to what Mr. Crush has to say about tragedy. He argues, and on this point I can only agree with him, that the ghosts of Ibsen are inferior to those of Rainier. No greater power of expression, no more significant gift of speech could have transformed Ibsen into Shakespeare. The materials from which the latter created his works, that is, his conception of human dignity, his sense of the importance of human passions, his vision of the breadth of human life, simply did not exist and could not exist for Ibsen, just as they did not exist nor could they exist for his contemporaries. God, man, and nature had somehow diminished over the intervening centuries, not because the realistic credo of modern art will lead us to seek petty people, but because this pettiness of human life has somehow been imposed by the same process that produced the development of realistic theories of art for which our vision could be justified. It is undeniable that the ancient type of tragedy that dealt with princes and their woes is not suited to our time. When we try to treat the woes of an obscure individual in the same manner, the effect is not the same. The reason is not a deterioration in our vision of life, but, on the contrary, the fact that we can no longer regard certain individuals as the great ones of the earth who are entitled to tragic passions, while all others must simply strive and labor to produce the magnificence of these few. Shakespeare says, "When beggars die, there are no comets. The heavens themselves blaze forth." The death of princes in Shakespeare's time, this sentiment, if not taken literally, at least expressed a practically universal perspective, deeply accepted by Shakespeare himself. Consequently, the death of the poetess Sina is comical, while the deaths of Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius are tragic. The cosmic sense of an individual death has been lost to us because we have become democratic, not only in outward forms, but also in our most intimate convictions. Therefore, modern high tragedy must concern itself more with the community than with the individual. I cite as an example of what I mean Ernestler's Mesopotamia. I do not argue that this work is as good as the best from the finest past epochs, but I argue that it is rightly comparable. It is noble, profound, and contemporary. It deals with heroic action and purifies through pity and terror, as Aristotle said it should. There are still too few examples of this type of modern tragedy, as the old techniques and old conditions must be abandoned without being replaced by simple, educated commonplaces. To write a tragedy, a man must feel the tragedy. To feel the tragedy, a man must be aware of the world in which he lives, not only with his mind but with his blood and nerves. Mr. Crush speaks throughout his book intermittently about despair, and one is moved by his heroic acceptance of a dark world. But the darkness is due to the fact that he and most men of letters have not yet learned to feel the old emotions in response to new stimuli. Stimuli exist, but not in literary circles. Literary circles have no vital contact with the life of the community, and this contact is necessary for men's feelings to have the gravity and depth in which both tragedy and true happiness develop. To all the talented young people who wander around feeling that there is nothing in the world they can do, I would say, stop trying to write, and instead try not to write. Go out into the world, become pirates, kings of Borneo, workers in Soviet Russia. Give yourselves an existence where the satisfaction of basic physical needs occupies almost all your energies. I do not recommend this path to everyone, but only to those who suffer from the illness that Mr. Crash diagnoses. I believe that after a few years of such an existence, the ex-intellectual will discover that despite his efforts, he can no longer refrain from writing, and when that moment comes, his writing will no longer seem useless to him. If you ask any man in America or any businessman in England what interferes most with his enjoyment of life, he will say the struggle for existence. He will say it with all sincerity and believe it. In one sense, that is true, but in another very important sense, it is profoundly false. The struggle for existence is something that can, of course, happen to any of us, and we are unhappy when it does. For example, it happened to Conrad's hero, who found himself on an abandoned ship with one of the two crewmen possessing firearms, with nothing to eat except the other men. When the two men finished the provisions they had agreed upon, a real struggle for existence began. Fall won, but then he became a vegetarian. That is not what the businessman means when he speaks of the struggle for existence. It is an imprecise expression he has gathered to lend dignity to something essentially trivial. Ask him how many men of his class have known hunger. Ask him what has become of his friends after they went bankrupt. Everyone knows that a ruined businessman is materially better off than a man who has never been rich enough to have the opportunity to go bankrupt. Therefore, what people mean by the struggle for existence is actually the struggle for success. What people fear when they engage in this struggle is not that they will not be able to have lunch the next morning, but that they will not surpass their neighbors. It is very singular to observe how little men seem to realize that they are not trapped in the claws of an inescapable mechanism, but that the wheel of the mill is simply the one in which they remain, because they have not become aware that it leads them to no higher level. I am, of course, thinking of the highest businessmen, those who already have a good income and who could, if they wished, live on what they have. It would seem shameful to them to desert their post in the face of the enemy, although if they were asked about the public cause they serve through their work, they would be unable to answer. As soon as they have gone through the clichés found in the advertisements for exhausting lives, let us consider the life of such a man. Suppose he has a charming house, a charming wife, and charming children. He gets up early in the morning while they are still asleep and hurries off to his office. There, he has the duty to display the qualities of a great executive. He cultivates a firm jaw, a decisive manner of speaking, and a calculated reserve to impress everyone except the secretary. He dictates letters, converses with various important people by phone, studies the market, and at some point has lunch with someone with whom he is making or hopes to make a deal. This repeats all afternoon, and then he returns home tired, just in time to prepare for dinner. During dinner, he and other tired men must pretend to enjoy the company of their wives, who have not yet had the chance to feel tired. How many hours will it take for the man to escape? It is impossible to predict. Eventually, he falls asleep, and for a few hours the tension relaxes. This man's professional life has the psychology of a 100-meter race, but since the race in which he is engaged has the only goal of the grave, the appropriate concentration for 100 meters becomes, in the end, somewhat excessive. What does he know about his children? During the weekdays he is at the office. On Sundays he is on the golf course. What does he know about his wife? When he leaves her in the morning, she is asleep. In the evening, He and she are occupied with social tasks that prevent intimate conversation. He probably has no important friends, although he has a number with which he feigns a geniality he wishes to feel, from spring to harvest. He knows only what affects the market. Europe has probably seen this type of man, but with absolute boredom. Books seem futile to him, and high-quality music, year after year, seems increasingly tedious. His attention narrows, and his life outside of business becomes more desiccated. I have seen this kind of man at maturity in Europe, with his wife and daughters. They had apparently convinced the poor man that it was time to take a vacation and allow his daughters to discover the old world. The mother and daughters, in ecstasy, surround him and draw his attention to every new element they deem characteristic. The father, completely exhausted and utterly bored, wonders what is happening at the office at that moment, or what is happening in the world of baseball. His women eventually leave him and conclude that males are Philistines. They never realize that he is a victim of their greed. This is not entirely true, as it is not the case for a European spectator. Probably in 9 cases out of 10, the widow was a voluntary victim, willing to be burned for glory and because religion commanded it. Religion and the glory of the businessman require him to make a lot of money. Thus, just as the Hindu widow willingly suffers, if the American businessman is to be happier, he must first change his religion. As long as he desires not only success, but is deeply convinced that it is a duty to pursue success, and that the man who does not do so is a poor creature, his life will remain too focused and anxious to be happy. Let us take a simple case like investments. Many Americans prefer to obtain 8% from a risky investment rather than 4% from a safe one. The consequence is that there are frequent losses of money and constant worries. For my part, what I would wish to obtain from money would certainly be free time, but what the typical modern man wishes to obtain with money is more money for ostentation, splendor, and to surpass those who were until then his equals. The social scale in America is indefinite and fluctuates continuously. Therefore, all unseen emotions become more agitated than where the social order is fixed. And although money in itself is not enough to make people great, it is difficult to be great without money. Moreover, earned money is the accepted measure of intelligence. A man who makes a lot of money is considered intelligent, while a man who does not is not. Nobody likes to be taken for a fool. Therefore, when the market is unstable, a man feels like a student during an exam. I believe we must admit that an element of fear, although irrational regarding the consequences of ruin, frequently enters the anxieties of a businessman. Arnold Bennett's Clayder, as rich as he became, always feared dying in an asylum. There is no doubt that those who have suffered greatly from poverty in their childhood are haunted by the fear that their children will experience the same thing, and feel that it is difficult to accumulate enough millions to protect against that disaster. These fears are probably inevitable in the first generation, but are less likely to affect those who have never known great poverty. In any case, they constitute a minor and somewhat exceptional factor in the problem. The root of the problem lies in the exaggerated emphasis on competitive success as the main source of happiness. I do not deny that the feeling of success enhances the pleasure of living. A painter, let us say, who has been obscure throughout his youth is probably happier when his talent is recognized. I do not deny either that money, up to a certain point, can increase happiness. Beyond that point, I do not believe it does. What I argue is that success can only be one ingredient of happiness, and that it is bought too dearly if it has sacrificed all other ingredients to obtain it. The origin of this problem is the predominant life philosophy in business circles. In Europe, it is true that there are still other circles that have prestige. In some countries, there is an aristocracy. In all, there are learned professions. And in the rest of the countries, except in a few small cases, the army and navy enjoy great respect. However, although it is true that there is a competitive element in success, regardless of a man's profession, the type of thing that is respected is not only success, but also excellence of any kind, which is the basis of success. A scientist may or may not make money, and will certainly be respected in the same way regardless of whether he does or not. No one is surprised when an eminent general or admiral is poor. In fact, poverty in such circumstances is, in a sense, an honor in itself. For these reasons, in Europe, the purely monetary competitive struggle is confined to certain circles, which are not necessarily the most influential or respected. In America, the situation is different. Services play too small a role in national life for their standards to have an influence. As for academic professions, no one can tell whether a doctor really knows much medicine or whether a lawyer really knows much law, and it is therefore easier to judge their merit by the income they derive from their standard of living. As for professors, they are servants hired by businessmen, and as such, they earn less respect than in older countries. The consequence of all this is that in America, the professional man imitates the businessman and does not constitute a separate type as he does in Europe. Therefore, in all affluent classes, nothing diminishes the relentless struggle for financial success. From a young age, American children feel that this is the only thing that matters and do not wish to be disturbed by an education that has no monetary value. Education was once largely perceived as training in the capacity to enjoy, that is, in those more delicate types that are beyond the reach of totally uncultured people. In the 18th century, one of the characteristics of a gentleman was an appreciation for literature, painting, and music. Today, we may disagree with his taste, but it was at least authentic. The rich man of today is sometimes cultivated, but often of a very different type. In the latter case, he never reads, even though he creates a gallery of paintings to enhance his renown. He relies on experts to choose his works. The pleasure he derives is not from looking at them, but from ensuring that another rich person does not possess them. As for music, if he is Jewish, he may have an authentic appreciation. Otherwise, he will be as uncultured in this regard as he is in the other arts. The result of all this is that he does not know what to do with his free time. As he grows richer, it becomes increasingly easy for him to make money, until 5 minutes a day yields him more than he knows how to spend. Thus, the poor man finds himself in a deadlock as a consequence of his success. This is inevitable as long as success itself is considered the goal of life. Unless a man is taught what to do with success after attaining it, reaching this success inevitably leaves him trapped in boredom. The competitive mental habit easily invades areas to which it does not belong. Take, for example, the issue of reading. There are 2 reasons for reading a book. One is to enjoy it, the other is to be able to boast about it. In the United States, it has become common for ladies to read or pretend to read books each month. Some read them, others read the first chapter, still others read the reviews, but all have these books on their tables, never reading an ancient masterpiece. There has never been a month when Hamlet or the Riley was selected by reading clubs, nor a month when it was necessary to know Dante. As a consequence, the reading that takes place consists entirely of modern books, which are rarely masterpieces, of course. This is also an effect of competition, perhaps not entirely bad, since most of the ladies in question, if left to their own devices, would read books even worse than those selected for them by their pastors and literary masters. The emphasis on competition in modern life is linked to a general decline in civilized standards, as was bound to occur in Rome after the time of Augustus. Men and women seem to have become incapable of enjoying the most intellectual pleasures. The art of general conversation, for example, perfected in the French salons of the 18th century, was still a living tradition 40 years ago. It was a very exquisite art that called for the highest faculties for something completely evanescent. But who cares about that in our time? In China, the art still flourished perfectly 10 years ago, but I imagine the missionary fervor of the nationalists has completely swept it away since then. The knowledge of good literature, which was universal among educated people 50 or 100 years ago, is now confined to a few professors. All the most tranquil pleasures have been abandoned. Some American students took me for a spring walk in a forest on the outskirts of their campus, full of exquisite wildflowers, but none of my guides knew the name of a single one. What would that knowledge be for? It could not increase anyone's income. The problem does not lie simply with the individual. No individual alone can escape it. The problem arises from the generally accepted philosophy of life, according to which life is a contest, a competition in which one must respect the victor. This point of view leads to an excessive development of the will at the expense of the senses and intellect. Perhaps by saying this, we are putting the cart before the horse. Puritan moralists have always emphasized the importance of will. In modern times, although it was faith that was initially emphasized, it is possible that the periods of Puritanism have bred a generation in which the will has developed excessively, while the senses and intellect have been starved, leading this generation to adopt a philosophy of competition as the most appropriate. Whatever its nature, the prodigious success of these modern dinosaurs, who, like their prehistoric prototypes, prefer power to intelligence, is rendering them universally limited. They have become the model of the white man everywhere, and it is likely that this will happen increasingly frequently over the next 100 years. However, those who are out of fashion may find comfort in the thought that the dinosaurs did not ultimately triumph. They killed each other off, and the intelligent spectators inherited their kingdom. Our modern dinosaurs are committing suicide. They have on average only 2 children per marriage, and they do not enjoy life enough to want to beget children. At this point, the excessively reductive philosophy they have inherited from their Puritan ancestors proves inadequate for the world. Those whose view of life provides them with so little happiness that they do not wish to beget children are biologically doomed. Before long, they will be replaced by something more joyful and fun. The competition viewed as the essence of life is too grim, too tenacious, a matter of taut muscles and wills to build a viable basis for life for more than 1 or 2 generations at most. After that time, it must provoke nervous fatigue, various escapist phenomena, a search for pleasures as tense and difficult as work, since relaxing has become impossible, and ultimately a disappearance of the lineage through sterility. It is not just work that is poisoned by the philosophy of competition. Leisure is as well. The type of leisure that is calm and restorative for the nerves becomes boring. There is a continuous acceleration, the natural end of which would be drugs and collapse. The remedy for this lies in acknowledging the role of healthy and quiet pleasure in an ideal of life balanced between boredom and excitement. Boredom, as a factor of human behavior, has, in my opinion, received much less attention than it deserves. I believe it has been one of the great driving forces throughout history and is more so today than ever. Boredom seems to be a distinctly human emotion. Certainly animals in captivity become apathetic, pacing back and forth and yawning, but in their natural state, I do not think they experience anything analogous to boredom. Most of the time they are on the lookout for enemies, food, or both at once. Sometimes they mate, sometimes they try to keep warm, but even when they are unhappy, I do not think they are bored. It is possible that great apes resemble us in this regard, as in so many others, but having never lived with them, I have not had the opportunity to experience it. One of the essential elements of boredom lies in the contrast between current circumstances and other more pleasant ones that irresistibly impose themselves on the imagination. It is also essential that the faculties of the individual are not fully occupied. Escaping from enemies attempting to take one's life is, I imagine, unpleasant, but certainly not boring. A man would not be bored while being executed, unless he possesses almost superhuman courage. Likewise, no one has ever yawned during their first speech in the House of Lords, except the late Duke of Devonshire, who was revered by their lordships. Therefore, boredom is essentially a frustrated desire for events. Not necessarily pleasant, but simply events that allow the victim of boredom to distinguish one day from another. The opposite of boredom, in a word, is not pleasure but enthusiasm. The desire for excitement is deeply rooted in human beings, particularly in men. I suppose that in the hunting era, it was easier to satisfy than it is today. Hunting was exciting, war was exciting, the court was exciting. A savage would manage to commit adultery with a woman while her husband slept beside her, knowing that it meant instant death if the husband woke up. This situation is, I imagine, not boring, but with the advent of agriculture, life began to become boring. Except, of course, for the aristocrats who remained and still remain in the hunting era. Much has been said about the boredom of machines, but I believe that the boredom of agriculture through obsolete methods is at least as great. In fact, contrary to what most philanthropists assert, I would say that the machine age has considerably reduced the amount of boredom in the world. Among wage earners, working hours are not solitary, while evenings can be devoted to a variety of entertainments impossible in an old-fashioned village. Let us reconsider the change in the life of the lower middle class. Once, after dinner, when the wife and daughters had tidied up, everyone would gather around what was called a happy family moment. This meant that while the head of the family withdrew to sleep, the wife would weave, and the daughters wished they were dead, or in Tom Booktuber, as they were forbidden to read or leave the room. The theory was that during this time their father conversed with them, which was supposed to be a pleasure for all. With a bit of luck, they would marry and have the opportunity to inflict on their children a youth as miserable as their own. If they were unlucky, they would become old maids, perhaps eventually decadent ladies, a fate as terrible as those that savages inflicted on their victims. All this weight of boredom must be taken into account when estimating the world 100 years ago. When one delves into the past, boredom becomes even worse. Imagine the monotony of winter in a medieval village. People could neither read nor write. They had only candles to light their evenings, and the smoke from their sole fireplace filled the one room that was not painfully cold. The paths were virtually impassable, so that one could barely see anyone from another village. Boredom must have been the reason for practicing witch hunts as the only sport to brighten winter afternoons. We are less bored than our ancestors, but we are more afraid of boredom. We have learned, or rather believed, that boredom is not part of man's natural destiny, but can be avoided by a sufficiently energetic pursuit of excitement. Young girls today earn their living largely because it allows them to seek thrills at night and escape the happy family time their grandmothers had to endure. Everyone who can lives in a city, those who do not have a car, or at least a motorcycle to go to the cinema, and of course, have a radio at home. Young men and women meet much more easily than before, and all the maids hope for at least once a week as much excitement as a heroine from a Jane Austen novel would have throughout an entire story. As we climb the social ladder, the search for sensation becomes increasingly intense. Those who can afford it move continuously from one place to another, bringing with them joy, dance, and drinks, but for some reason they always expect to enjoy themselves more in a new place. Those who have to earn a living know their share of boredom out of necessity during working hours, but those who have enough money to free themselves from the need to work have as their ideal a life completely free of boredom. It is a noble ideal, and I do not intend to discredit it. But I fear that, like other ideals, it is more difficult to achieve than idealists assume. After all, mornings are boring to the same extent that the previous afternoons have been pleasant. There will be a medieval period, perhaps even old age. At 20, men think life is over. At 30, I can no longer adopt that view at 58. Perhaps it is as unwise to squander vital capital as it is to squander financial capital. Perhaps a certain element of boredom is a necessary ingredient in life. The desire to escape boredom is natural. Indeed, all human races have manifested it when the opportunity arose. When savages first tasted spirits from the hands of white men, they finally found an escape from ancestral boredom. And unless government intervention occurred, they got drunk to death after wars, pogroms, and persecutions. This was part of the escape from boredom. Even fights with neighbors were deemed better than nothing. Therefore, boredom is a vital issue for the moralist, as at least half of humanity's sins are caused by the fear of it. However, boredom should not be regarded as entirely bad. There are two types of boredom, one of which is fruitful, while the other is numbing. Fruitful boredom arises from the substance of drugs, while numbing boredom stems from the absence of vital activities. I'm not ready to say that drugs can play no beneficial role in life. There are moments, for example, when a wise doctor prescribes an opioid, and I believe these moments are more frequent than prohibitionists think. But the desire to consume drugs is undoubtedly something that cannot be left to the workings of natural impulse, and the type of boredom that a person accustomed to drugs feels when deprived of them is something for which I can suggest no remedy other than time. What applies to drugs also applies, to some extent, to all types of excitement. A life too filled with excitement is an exhausting life, requiring continuously stronger stimuli to provide the emotion deemed essential for pleasure. A person used to excessive excitement is like someone with a morbid obsession for pepper, which would suffocate anyone else. There is an element of boredom that is inseparable from the avoidance of excessive excitement, and excess excitement not only undermines health, but dulls the taste for any type of pleasure, replacing deep organic satisfactions with excitements, intelligence with wisdom, and incisive surprises with beauty. I do not want to push the objection to excitement to the extreme. A certain amount is healthy, but like almost everything else, the issue is quantitative. Very little can produce morbid obsessions, while too much leads to exhaustion. A certain power to endure boredom is essential for a happy life, and this is one of the things that should be taught to the young. All great books contain boring parts, and all great lives have had uninteresting periods. Let us imagine a modern editor confronted with the Old Testament as a new manuscript presented for the first time. It is not hard to think what his comments would be, for example, on the genealogists. "My dear sir," he would say, "this chapter lacks liveliness. You cannot expect your reader to be interested in an endless series of names of people you talk so little about. I admit that you started your story with style. The beginning impressed me very favorably, but you are too eager to tell everything. Cut out the superfluous parts, reduce it to a reasonable length, and bring me your manuscript." Thus would speak a modern editor, knowing the modern reader's fear of boredom. He would say the same of the classics of Confucius, the Quran, Marx's Capital, and all other sacred books that have proven to be bestsellers. This applies not only to sacred books. All the best novels contain boring passages. A novel that shines from the first to the last page is not a great book. Similarly, the lives of most great men have not been exciting, except in a few great moments. Socrates could enjoy a banquet from time to time, and must have found considerable satisfaction in his conversations while the hemlock took effect. But for the most part, he lived quietly with Xantippe, taking a constitution in the afternoon, and perhaps meeting a few friends along the way. It is said that Kant never went more than 10 miles from Königsberg in his entire life. Darwin, after circling the globe, spent the rest of his life in his own home. Marx, after provoking a few revolutions, decided to spend the rest of his days at the British Museum. Generally, it will be seen that a quiet life is characteristic of great men and that their pleasures have not been of the kind that seemed exciting to others. No great achievement is possible without persistent work, so absorbing and difficult that it leaves barely enough energy for even the most exhausting entertainment, except for those that serve to recover physical energy during vacations, of which mountaineering may be the best example. The ability to endure a more or less monotonous life is something that must be acquired from childhood. Modern parents are largely responsible in this regard. They provide their children with too much passive entertainment, such as shows and good food, not realizing the importance for a child to spend one day like another, except, of course, on rare occasions. The pleasures of childhood should primarily be those that the child derives from their environment through some effort and inventiveness. Pleasures that are exciting and at the same time require no physical effort, such as theater, for example, should occur rarely. Excitement has the nature of a drug that one will need more and more of, and physical passivity during excitement is contrary to instinct. A child develops better when not too disturbed, like a young plant. Too much travel or variety of impressions is not good for the young, as it renders them incapable of enduring fruitful monotony when they grow up. I do not mean to say that monotony has no merit in itself. I only want to say that some good things are only possible when there is a certain degree of monotony. Take, for example, Wordsworth's preamble. It will be evident to any reader that everything of value in Wordsworth's thoughts and feelings would have been impossible for a sophisticated young urbanite. A child or a young person with a serious constructive purpose will willingly endure a great deal of boredom that he finds necessary along the way. But constructive purposes do not easily form in the mind of a young person if he lives a life of distractions and dissipations, for in that case, his thoughts will always be directed toward the next pleasure rather than a distant accomplishment. For all these reasons, a generation that cannot endure boredom will be a generation of small men, inappropriately separated from the slow processes of nature, men whose every vital impulse withers slowly like cut flowers in a vase. I do not like mystical language, but I hardly know how to express what I want to say without using phrases that sound more poetic than scientific. Regardless of what we want to think, we are creatures of the earth. Our life is part of the life of the earth, and we nourish ourselves from it like plants and animals. The rhythm of earthly life is slow. Autumn and winter are just as essential as spring and summer, and rest is just as essential as movement for the child, even more so than for the adult. It is necessary to maintain some contact with the ebb and flow of earthly life. The human body has adapted through the ages to this rhythm, and religion has preserved some of it in the celebration of Easter. I once saw a 2-year-old child who had lived in London go out for the first time to walk in the green countryside. The season was winter, and everything was wet and muddy. To the adult eye, there was nothing delightful about it, but the child exhibited a strange ecstasy. He knelt on the wet ground, buried his face in the grass, and let out half-articulated cries of delight. The joy he felt was primitive, simple, and massive. The organic need that was satisfied is so profound that those who hunger for it are rarely entirely sound of mind. Many of the pleasures we can enjoy, play being a good example, have no element of that contact with the earth. Such pleasures, once they cease, leave a man feeling dusty, unsatisfied, hungry for something he cannot name. These pleasures bring nothing that could be called joy, but on the contrary, those that connect us with the life of the earth have something deeply satisfying, and when their effect fades, the happiness they brought persists, even if their intensity may have been less than that of more exciting dissipations. The distinction I have in mind runs through the entire range, from the simplest occupations to the most civilized. The 2-year-old child I mentioned earlier displayed the most primitive form of connection with earthly life. For if we seek a higher form, we find it in poetry. What makes Shakespeare's works supreme is that they are full of that same joy that made the 2-year-old embrace the grass. Take, for example, The Lark Ascending or The Yellow Sands. You will find in these poems the civilized expression of the same emotion that our 2-year-old could express only in inarticulate cries. Love is an experience in which our entire being is renewed and refreshed like plants by rain after drought. In loveless sexual relationships, there is none of this. When the momentary pleasure ends, there is fatigue, disgust, and a feeling that life is empty. Love is part of earthly life. Loveless sex is not. The special type of boredom suffered by modern urban populations is linked to their separation from earthly life. It renders life warm, dusty, and thirsty, like a pilgrimage in the desert among those wealthy enough to choose their way of life. The particular kind of intolerable boredom people suffer from is, paradoxically, due to their fear of boredom. In fleeing the type of fruitful boredom, they end up with a much more serious boredom. A happy life must be largely a tranquil life, for it is only in an atmosphere of tranquility that one can live with true joy. Fatigue comes in many types, some being a much more serious obstacle to happiness than others. Purely physical fatigue, as long as it is not excessive, tends to be a source of happiness because it leads to deep sleep and good appetite, making possible pleasures during holidays enjoyable. But when it is excessive, it becomes a very serious evil. Rural women in all communities except the most advanced are old by 30, exhausted by excessive work. Children in the early days of industrialism suffered from stunted growth and often died from overwork in their early years. This is still the case in China and Japan, where industrialism is recent, and to some extent also in the southern United States. Physical labor beyond a certain point is a dreadful torture, and often it has been pushed so far that life becomes almost unbearable. However, in the most advanced parts of the modern world, physical fatigue has been significantly reduced due to improvements in industrial conditions. The most common type of fatigue today in advanced communities is nervous fatigue, which, curiously, is more pronounced in affluent individuals and tends to be much less significant in wage workers than in businessmen and intellectual workers. Escaping nervous fatigue in modern life is very difficult, primarily during working hours and even more during the time that passes between work and home. The urban worker is subjected to noises, most of which he has learned to consciously ignore, but which nonetheless exhaust him, especially due to the subconscious effort required to not hear them. Another cause of fatigue, without our being aware of it, is the constant presence of strangers. The natural instinct of man, like that of other animals, is to examine every stranger of his kind, to decide whether he will behave in a friendly or hostile manner. This instinct must be inhibited by those who travel on the subway during rush hour, and the result of this inhibition is that they feel a generalized and diffuse anger toward all the strangers they encounter in this involuntary contact. Then, there is the morning train rush, with the resulting dyspepsia. Therefore, when one arrives at the office and the workday begins, the worker is already on edge and tends to view humanity as a nuisance. His employer, who arrives with the same state of mind, does nothing to dissipate this tension in the employee. The fear of dismissal compels a respectful demeanor, but this unnatural behavior only increases nervous tension. If once a week, employees could stick out their tongues at the employer and otherwise express what they think of him, the nervous tension for them would be alleviated. But for the employer, who has his own problems, that would resolve nothing. What the fear of dismissal is for the employee, the fear of bankruptcy is for the entrepreneur. Some, it is true, are large enough to be above this fear, but to attain such a high position, They have generally had to go through years of exhausting struggle, during which they had to remain constantly informed about what is happening everywhere in the world and continuously thwart the schemes of their competitors. The result of all this is that when solid success arrives, the man is already a bundle of nerves, so accustomed to anxiety that he cannot shake off this habit, even after the need has disappeared. There are rich children, but they generally manage to create anxieties as close as possible to those they would have suffered had they not been born wealthy. By gambling and playing, they earn their parents' dissatisfaction. By sacrificing their sleep for their amusements, they weaken their constitution, and when they settle down, they become as incapable of happiness as their parents before them. Voluntarily or involuntarily, by choice or necessity, most modern people lead a nervous life, where they are continuously too fatigued to enjoy without the help of alcohol. With the exception of the rich who are simply foolish, let us consider the most common case of those whose fatigue is associated with exhausting work to earn a living. Largely, the fatigue in these cases is due to worry, and worry could be avoided with a better philosophy of life or a little more mental discipline. Most men and women are very deficient in controlling their thoughts. By this, I mean that they cannot help but think about worrying subjects when they can do nothing about them. People bring their work concerns to bed, and in the hours of the night, when they should be acquiring new strength to face the morning problems, they go over in their minds the problems they can do nothing about at that moment, thinking about them in such a way as to produce a solid course of action for the next day, but in the half-crazy way that characterizes the agitated meditations of insomnia. A part of the madness of the night remains with them, which in the morning clouds their judgment, spoils their temperament, and makes every obstacle exasperating. The wise man thinks about his problems only when there is a purpose in doing so. Otherwise he thinks of something else, or if it is night, of nothing at all. I do not mean to suggest that in the case of a great crisis, for instance, when ruin is imminent, or when a man has reason to suspect that his wife is unfaithful, it is possible, except for a few exceptionally disciplined minds, to put aside problems when nothing can be done about them. But it is entirely possible to ignore the ordinary problems of ordinary days, except when one has to face them. It is amazing to see how much happiness and efficiency can be increased by cultivating an orderly mind, which thinks about a question appropriately at the right moment, rather than inappropriately all the time. Thus, when it comes time to make a difficult or worrying decision, as soon as all the information is available, think it over carefully and make your decision. Once the decision is made, do not revisit it unless you learn a new fact. Nothing is as exhausting and pointless as indecision. Many people can relax by realizing the slight importance of the issue that causes anxiety. At first, every speech terrified me, and my nerves made me speak very poorly. I dreaded the ordeal so much that I always hoped to break a leg before having to give a speech, and once it was over, I was exhausted by nervous attention. Gradually, I learned to feel that, no matter how well or poorly I spoke, the universe would remain unchanged. I discovered that the less I cared about speaking well or poorly, the better I spoke, and gradually, the nervous attention diminished almost to the point of disappearing. A large part of nervous fatigue can be alleviated in this way. Our actions are not as important as we naturally assume. Our successes and failures do not matter much after all. Even great sorrows can be overcome. Problems that seem to end happiness forever fade with time, until it becomes almost impossible to remember their impact. But beyond these egocentric considerations, there is the fact that the ego itself is not a very large part of the world. The man who can concentrate his thoughts and hopes on something that transcends the self can find a certain peace in the ordinary problems of life, which is impossible for the pure egoist. What could be called nerve hygiene has been very little studied, although industrial psychology has conducted thorough research on fatigue, showing through careful statistics that if one continues doing something for a long enough period, one will eventually become very tired, a result that could have been guessed without so much scientific display. The study of fatigue by psychologists mainly concerns muscular fatigue, although there are also a number of studies on fatigue in school-age children. However, none of these studies address the important problem of the type of fatigue that is always emotional in modern life. Purely intellectual fatigue, like purely muscular fatigue, produces its own remedy in sleep. Anyone who has to do a lot of intellectual work devoid of emotion such as complex calculations, will end each day with the fatigue that the day has brought. The damage attributed to overwork is almost always due to worry or anxiety, rather than to that cause. The problem with emotional fatigue is that it interferes with rest. The more tired a man is, the more impossible it is for him to stop. One of the symptoms of an approaching nervous breakdown is the belief that his work is terribly important and that taking a vacation will lead to all kinds of disasters. If I were a doctor, I would prescribe vacations to any patient who considers his work important. The nervous breakdown that seems to be caused by work is actually, in every case I have personally known, caused by an emotional problem from which the patient tries to escape through his work. He resists leaving his job because if he does, he will have nothing to distract him from his thoughts of misery, whatever they may be. Of course, the problem may be the fear of bankruptcy, and in this case, his work is directly related to his worry. But even then, it is likely that worry drives him to work so long that his judgment becomes clouded, and bankruptcy occurs more quickly than if he worked less. In all cases, it is the emotional problem and not the work that causes the collapse. The psychology of worry is not at all simple. I have already spoken about mental discipline, that is to say, the habit of thinking about things at the appropriate moment. This is important, first, because it allows one to get through the workday with less expenditure of thought, then because it offers a remedy for insomnia, and finally because it promotes efficiency and wisdom in decisions. But these methods do not touch the subconscious or the unconscious, and when a problem is serious, none of these methods are very useful unless they penetrate below the level of consciousness. Psychologists have studied a lot about the functioning of the unconscious on the subconscious, but much less about the functioning of the conscious on the unconscious. However, the latter is of great importance in the field of mental hygiene and must be understood if rational beliefs are to act in the realm of the subconscious. This particularly applies to the issue of worry. It is quite easy to tell oneself that a particular misfortune would not be so terrible if it occurred, but as long as it remains a mere conscious conviction, it will not affect the night watchman, nor prevent the occurrence of nightmares. My own belief is that a conscious thought can be planted in the subconscious if it is given a sufficient amount of vigor and intensity. Most of the subconscious consists of what were once highly emotional conscious thoughts that are now buried. It is possible to deliberately carry out this process of burying, and in this way, the subconscious can be led to do a lot of useful work. For example, I have found that if I have to write on a rather difficult subject, the best plan is to think about that subject with great intensity, the greatest intensity of which I am capable for a few hours or days, and at the end of that time to give orders, so to speak, so that the work continues underground. After a few months, I consciously revisit the subject and find that the work has been accomplished even before I discovered this technique. Previously, I spent the intervening months worrying about the lack of progress, which made me arrive at the solution much later due to that worry, and the intervening months were wasted. Now, I can dedicate them to other tasks. One can adopt a similar process to manage anxieties. When a catastrophe looms on the horizon, think seriously and deliberately about what the worst-case scenario would be. After clearly considering the worst eventuality, present solid reasons for thinking that, after all, it would not be such a terrible disaster. Such reasons always exist, for in the worst case, nothing that happens to us has cosmic significance. When you have firmly looked at the worst possibility for a certain period and have told yourself with genuine conviction, well, after all, it wouldn't matter much, you will find that your concern diminishes quite extraordinarily. It may be necessary to repeat the process a few times, but in the end, if you have not avoided facing the worst possible question, you will see that your worry completely disappears and is replaced by a form of delight. This is part of a more general technique for avoiding fear. Worry is a form of fear, and all forms of fear produce fatigue. A man who has learned not to feel fear will find that the fatigue of daily life is considerably reduced. Now, fear in its most harmful form occurs when we face a danger we are not prepared to confront. At unexpected moments, horrible thoughts arise in our minds, and what is frightening depends on the person, but almost everyone has a latent fear. For one man, it is cancer. For another, ruin. For a third, the discovery of a shameful secret. For a fourth, suspicions of jealousy. For a fifth, The nighttime thoughts that the hell stories told to him as a child might be true. Probably, all these people use a wrong technique to confront their fear whenever it comes to mind, as they try to think of something else. That is to say, to distract their thoughts with entertainment or work or something else. However, every form of fear worsens when it is not faced. The effort to divert thoughts is a tribute to the horror of the spectre one tries to avoid. The appropriate approach with every type of fear is to think about it rationally and calmly, but with great concentration, until you become completely familiar with it. Eventually, as familiarity mitigates your terrors, the subject will become boring, making your thoughts more detached from it, not through an effort of will, but through a simple lack of interest in the subject. When you feel compelled to meditate on something, no matter what, the best plan is always to think about it even more than you would naturally, until its morbid fascination fades. One of the areas where modern morality is most deficient is the question of fear. It is true that physical courage, especially in wartime, is expected of men, but other forms of courage are not expected of women. A courageous woman must hide it if she wants to please conventional men. The man who is courageous in everything except physical danger is also poorly regarded. Indifference to public opinion, for example, is seen as a challenge, and the public does everything to punish the man who dares to defy its authority. All of this is very contrary to what it should be, as every form of courage, whether in a man or a woman, should be admired as much as physical courage in a soldier. The fact that physical courage is so common among young men proves that courage can manifest in response to public opinion that demands it. If there were more courage, there would be fewer worries and thus less fatigue, since a large proportion of the nervous fatigue suffered by men and women today is due to conscious or unconscious fears. A very frequent source of fatigue is the love of excitement. If a man could spend his free time sleeping, he would remain fit. But his working hours are monotonous, and he feels the need for pleasure during his free moments. The problem is that the easiest and most superficially appealing pleasures are primarily of the kind that exhaust the nerves. The desire for excitement, when it exceeds a certain point, is a sign of a twisted disposition or an instinctive dissatisfaction. In the early days of a happy marriage, most men do not feel the need for excitement, but in the modern world, marriage must often be postponed for so long that when it finally becomes economically possible, excitement has become a habit that can only be contained for a short period. If public opinion allowed men to marry at 21 without the financial burdens that marriage currently entails, many men would never seek pleasures as exhausting as their work. However, even suggesting that this be possible is immoral, as shown by the fate of the judge who suffered disgrace despite a long and honorable career for the sole crime of wanting to save young people from the misfortunes in which they find themselves due to the intolerance of their elders. However, I will not delve into this topic for now, as it enters into the question of envy, which we will address in a later chapter. For the private individual who cannot change the laws and institutions under which he lives, it is difficult to face the situation created and perpetuated by oppressive moralists. However, it is important to realize that exciting pleasures do not lead to happiness. Although, as long as they remain inaccessible, the most satisfying joys, a man can hardly bear life without the help of excitement. In such a situation, the only thing a prudent man can do is to moderate himself and not allow himself a quantity of exhausting pleasures that undermine his health or interfere with his work. The radical cure for the problems of youth lies in a change of public morality. In the meantime, a young person would do well to reflect that, in the end, he will be in a position to marry, and that it would be unwise to live in such a way as to make a happy marriage impossible, which can easily happen due to tense nerves and an acquired inability for sweeter pleasures. One of the worst characteristics of nervous fatigue is that it acts as a sort of filter between a man and the outside world. Impressions come to him, so to speak, muted and muffled. He notices people only to irritate himself with their little quirks or behaviors. He takes no pleasure in his meals or in the sun, but tends to concentrate intensely on a few objects and become indifferent to everything else. This state of affairs makes rest impossible, so that fatigue continuously increases until it reaches a point where medical treatment is necessary. All of this is, in the end, a punishment for having lost contact with reality, which we discussed in the previous chapter. But it is not easy to see how to maintain that contact in our large modern urban centers. Thus, we find ourselves once again apart from the great social issues that I do not intend to address in this volume. Jealousy after worry is probably one of the most powerful causes of unhappiness. Jealousy is, I would say, one of the most universal and profound human passions. It is very noticeable in children even before their first birthday, and must be treated with the utmost respect by any educator. The slightest appearance of favoring one child over another is observed and felt immediately. An absolute, rigid, and unchanging distributive justice must be observed by anyone dealing with children. But young children are only slightly more open in their expressions of jealousy and resentment, which is a particular form of jealousy, than adults. This emotion is as common in adults as in children. For example, I remember that when one of our servants who was married became pregnant and we told her not to lift heavy loads, the immediate result was that none of the others wanted to lift the same loads, and all such work had to be done by us. Jealousy is at the root of democracy. Heraclitus claimed that the citizens of Ephesus should all be hanged because they said there would be no one first among them. The democratic movement in the Greek states must have been almost entirely inspired by this passion, and the same applies to modern democracy. There is, it is true, an idealistic theory that democracy is the best form of government. I personally believe that this theory is true, but there is no area of practical politics where idealistic theories have sufficient force to bring about great changes. When great changes occur, the theories that justify them are always a camouflage for passion, and the passion that has given strength to democratic theories is undoubtedly the passion of jealousy. Read the memoirs of Madame Roland, often portrayed as a noble woman inspired by devotion to the people, and you will discover that what transformed her into such a passionate democrat was the experience of being relegated to the servants' hall during her visit to an aristocratic castle. Among moderately respectable women, jealousy plays an extraordinarily important role. You are sitting in the subway, and a well-dressed woman passes through the car. Observe the eyes of the other women. You will see that all, with the possible exception of those who are better dressed, look at the woman with malevolent glances and strive to draw unflattering conclusions about her. The love of scandal is an expression of this general malice. Any story involving another woman is immediately believed, even with the weakest evidence. A high moral standard serves the same purpose. We envy those who have the opportunity to sin against it, and consider ourselves virtuous by punishing them for their sins. This particular form of virtue is certainly its own reward. However, the same can be observed among men, with the difference that women consider all other women as their competitors, while men, in general, feel this sentiment only towards other men in the same profession. Have you been foolish enough to praise an artist in front of another artist? Have you praised a politician in front of another politician from the same party? Have you praised an Egyptologist in front of another Egyptologist? If you have, there's a 100-to-1 chance that you sparked an explosion of jealousy. In the correspondence of Leibniz and Huguenot, there are several letters where they lament the supposed fact that Newton has gone mad. They say to each other, "Isn't it sad that the incomparable genius of Mr. Newton has been obscured by the loss of reason?" And these two eminent men, letter after letter, wept crocodile tears with obvious delight. In reality, the event they hypocritically mourned had not taken place, although a few examples of eccentric behavior fueled the rumor. Among all the characteristics of ordinary human nature, jealousy is the most unfortunate. The jealous person does not merely wish to inflict misfortune, but does so whenever possible with impunity, and he makes himself unhappy through jealousy. Instead of deriving pleasure from what he possesses, he feels pain for what others have. If he can, he deprives others of their advantages, which is as desirable for him as ensuring those advantages for himself. If this passion is allowed to run wild, it becomes fatal to all excellence and even to the most useful exercise of exceptional skill. Why should a doctor travel to his patients by car while a laborer must walk to work? Why should a scientific researcher spend his time in a warm room while others must face the elements? Why should a man with a rare talent of great importance to the world be spared the monotony of his own household chores? Jealousy finds no answer to these questions. Fortunately, however, there exists in human nature a compensatory passion, admiration. He who wishes to increase human happiness must desire to increase admiration and diminish jealousy. What remedy is there for jealousy for the saint? There is the cure of disinterestedness. Yet even in the case of saints, jealousy among saints is not at all impossible. I doubt that Saint Simeon the Stylite would have been entirely happy to learn that another saint had remained longer on an even narrower column. But setting aside the saints, the only remedy for jealousy for ordinary men and women is happiness. And the difficulty lies in the fact that jealousy is in itself a terrible obstacle to happiness. I believe that jealousy is immensely favored by the misfortunes of childhood. A child who encounters a favored brother or sister acquires the habit of jealousy, and when he enters the world, he seeks the injustices of which he is a victim, perceiving them immediately if they occur, and imagining them if they do not. Such a man is inevitably unhappy and becomes a source of annoyance to his friends, who cannot always remember to avoid imaginary slights. Having started by believing that he is unloved, he ends up making his belief true through his behavior. Another misfortune of childhood having the same effect is having parents without much parental feeling. Without having a brother or sister unduly favored, a child may perceive that the children of other families are more cherished by their father and mother than he is. This will lead him to hate other children and his own parents, and as he grows up, he will feel like an Ishmael. Certain types of happiness are a natural right for everyone, and being deprived of them almost inevitably leads to becoming twisted and bitter. If the jealous person can say, "What good does it do to tell me that the remedy for jealousy is happiness? I cannot find happiness as long as I feel jealousy, and you tell me that I cannot cease being jealous before I find happiness." Real life is never as logical as that. The mere act of becoming aware of the causes of one's own feelings of jealousy is a great step toward their healing. The habit of thinking in terms of comparisons is fatal. When something pleasant happens, it must be fully appreciated, without wondering whether it is as pleasant as something that might happen to someone else. Yes, the jealous person says, "It is a sunny day and it is spring, the birds are singing and the flowers are blooming," but it is understood that spring in Sicily is 1,000 times more beautiful, the birds sing more exquisitely in the trees of Helicon, and the rose of Sharon is more beautiful than those in my garden. And while he thinks of these things, the sun darkens, the bird's song becomes a senseless chirping, and the flowers seem unworthy of any attention. All the other joys of life are treated in the same way. Yes, he will tell himself, the lady of my heart is charming. I love her and she loves me. But how much more exquisite must the Queen of Sheba have been? If only I had had the opportunities of Solomon. All these comparisons are useless and absurd. Whether it is the Queen of Sheba or our neighbor next door, the cause of discontent is equally pointless for the wise man. What one possesses remains pleasant, no matter what others possess. Jealousy indeed is a form of vice, both moral and intellectual, consisting of not seeing things in themselves, but only in relation to others. I earn, let's say, a salary sufficient for my needs. I would be content, but I learn that another person, who is not considered absolutely superior, earns a salary twice as high as mine. Instantly, if I have a jealous disposition, the satisfactions derived from what I have darken, and I begin to be consumed by a feeling of injustice. For all this, the appropriate remedy is mental discipline, the habit of not having unnecessary thoughts. After all, what could be more enviable than happiness? And if I can heal myself from jealousy, I can attain happiness and become enviable. The man who earns double my salary undoubtedly feels tortured by the thought that someone else has in turn double what he has, and so on. If you desire glory, you can envy Napoleon, but Napoleon envied Caesar. Caesar envied Alexander, and Alexander, I may say, envied Hercules, who never existed. Therefore, you cannot free yourself from jealousy simply through success, because there will always be someone in history or legend who is more successful than you. You can escape jealousy by enjoying the pleasures you receive, doing the work you have to do, and avoiding comparisons with those whom you may falsely imagine to be luckier than you. Unnecessary modesty is closely linked to jealousy. Modesty is considered a virtue, but for my part, I doubt that in its most extreme forms it deserves to be regarded as such. Modest people need a lot of security, and often do not dare to attempt tasks they are quite capable of accomplishing. Modest individuals believe themselves to be overshadowed by those with whom they have regular interactions, and are therefore particularly prone to envy, and through it to worry and ill will. For my part, I think there is much to be said for raising a child to see themselves as a good person. I do not believe that a peacock envies another for its tail, because each peacock is convinced that its own tail is the most beautiful in the world. The consequence of this is that peacocks are peaceful birds. Imagine how unhappy a peacock's life would be if it had been taught that having a high opinion of oneself is bad. Every time it saw another peacock display its tail, it would say to itself, "I must not imagine that my tail is better than that of this other, for that would be pride. But how I wish that were the case. This cursed bird is so convinced of its own magnificence, I would tear its feathers out, and perhaps I would no longer have to fear comparison with it. Or perhaps I would set a trap for it and prove that it is a malevolent peacock guilty of unpeaceful behavior, and I would denounce it before the assembly of leaders. Gradually, I would establish the principle that peacocks with particularly beautiful tails are almost always malevolent, and that the wise ruler of the kingdom of peacocks would seek the modest bird with only a few scattered tail feathers. Once this principle is accepted, he would have all the most refined birds killed, and eventually a truly splendid tail would become only a distant memory of the past. Perhaps this is the victory of envy disguised as morality. But when each peacock believes itself to be more splendid than the others, there is no need for all this repression. Each peacock hopes to win the first prize in the competition, and each, because it values its own tail, believes it has won. Envy is, of course, closely linked to competition. We do not envy good fortune that we conceive as out of our reach. In an age where social hierarchy is fixed, the lower classes do not envy the upper classes, as long as they think that the division between rich and poor is ordained by God. Beggars do not envy millionaires, although they will, of course, envy other beggars who are more successful. The instability of social status in the modern world and the egalitarian doctrines of democracy and socialism have considerably broadened the scope of envy. For now, it is an evil, but it is an evil to endure to achieve a fairer social system. As soon as one reflects rationally on inequalities, they are seen as unjust. Unless they are based on some superiority of merit, and as soon as they are perceived as unjust, there is no remedy for the resulting envy except the elimination of injustice. Our time is therefore one where envy plays a particularly important role. The poor envy the rich, the poorest nations envy the richest, women envy men, and virtuous women envy those who, without being so, remain unpunished. While it is true that envy is the main driving force leading to justice between different classes, nations, and sexes, it is also true that the type of justice one can expect as a result of envy is probably the worst possible, that is to say, one that consists more in diminishing the pleasures of the fortunate than in increasing those of the unfortunate. The passions that ravage private life also ravage public life. It cannot be assumed that something as bad as envy can yield good results. Therefore, those who, for idealistic reasons, wish for profound changes in our social system and a significant increase in social justice must hope that other forces, in addition to envy, will be decisive in bringing about these changes. All bad things are interconnected, and each is likely to be the cause of another. In particular, fatigue is a very common cause of envy. When a man feels ill-suited to the work he must do, he experiences a general dissatisfaction that is very likely to take the form of envy towards those whose work is less demanding. One way to reduce envy is to eliminate fatigue, but the most important thing is to ensure a life that satisfies instinct. Much of the envy that seems purely professional actually has a sexual origin. A man who is happy in his marriage and with his children is unlikely to feel much envy towards other men for their greater wealth or success, as long as he has enough to raise his children in the way he deems right. The essence of human happiness is simple, so simple that sophisticated people do not dare to admit what they actually lack. The women we have discussed, who look enviously at every well-dressed woman, are surely not happy in their instinctive lives. Instinctive happiness is rare in the Anglo-Saxon world, especially among women. Civilization in this sense seems to have gone astray. For there to be less envy, ways must be found to remedy this state of affairs, and if these means are not found, our civilization runs the danger of destroying itself. In the past, people only envied their neighbors because they knew little about others. Now, thanks to education and the press, they know a great deal in an abstract manner about large classes of humanity, none of whose individuals they know. Through films, they believe they know how the rich live. Through newspapers, they learn a lot about the malice of foreign nations. Through propaganda, they know the harmful practices of all those whose skin has a different pigmentation than theirs. The yellows hate the whites hate the blacks, etc. All this hate, it will be said, is stirred up by propaganda. But this is a somewhat superficial explanation, as propaganda is much more successful when it stirs up hatred than when it tries to provoke friendly feelings. The reason is clearly that the human heart, as shaped by modern civilization, is more prone to hatred than to friendship. And it is inclined to anxiety because it is dissatisfied, because it deeply feels, perhaps even unconsciously, that it has lost in some way the sense of life, that perhaps others, but not ourselves, have secured the good things that nature offers for the pleasure of man. The positive sum of pleasures in the life of modern man is undoubtedly greater than that found in primitive communities, but the awareness of what could still be increased persists. When taking their children to the zoo, one often observes in the eyes of the monkeys, when they are not performing gymnastic feats or cracking nuts, a strange and tense sadness. One can almost imagine that they sense they must become men, but they cannot discover the secret to achieving this. Along the way, in evolution, they lost their way, their cousins progressed, and they were left behind. A part of the same attention and anxiety seems to have entered the soul of civilized man. He knows that there is something better than himself within reach, but he does not know where to look or how to find it. Desperate, he turns against his fellow beings, who are just as lost and just as unhappy. We have reached a stage of evolution that is not the final phase. We must pass through it quickly, for otherwise, most of us will perish along the way, and others will become lost in a forest of doubts and fears. Therefore, envy, as bad as it is, and whatever its terrible effects, is not wholly bad. It is partly the expression of a heroic pain, the pain of those who advance in darkness, perhaps toward a better resting place, perhaps merely toward death and destruction. To find the right way out of this despair, civilized man must expand his heart as he has expanded his mind. He must learn to transcend the self and, in doing so, acquire the freedom of the universe. We have already had the opportunity to say something about the meaning of sin in the first chapter, but we must now delve deeper into this subject, as it is one of the most important psychological causes of unhappiness in adult life. There exists a traditional religious psychology of sin that no modern psychologist can accept. It was primarily assumed among Protestants that the conscience reveals to every man when an act to which he is tempted is sinful, so that after committing it, he may feel one of two painful feelings, one called remorse, which has no merit, and the other called repentance, capable of washing away his fault. In Protestant countries, even many who have lost their faith have continued to accept for a time, with more or less modifications, the orthodox view of sin. Today, partly thanks to psychoanalysis, we are faced with the opposite situation. Not only do the non-orthodox reject the old doctrine of sin, but many of those who still consider themselves orthodox do so as well. Conscience has ceased to be something mysterious that could be regarded as the voice of God. We know that conscience dictates different acts in different parts of the world, and that, generally speaking, it is everywhere in accord with tribal custom. So, what really happens when a man's conscience troubles him? The word conscience covers several different feelings. The simplest of these is the fear of being discovered. I'm sure you have led a completely irreproachable life. But if you ask someone who has acted in a way for which they would be punished if discovered, you will find that when discovery seemed imminent, that person regretted their crime. I'm not saying that this applies to professional thieves who consider a certain amount of prison time as a business risk, but it does apply to what can be called the respectable offender, such as the bank manager who embezzled funds in a moment of stress, or the clerk who was tempted by passion in a sexual irregularity. These men may forget their crime when there seems to be little chance of being discovered, but when they are found out or are in serious danger of being discovered, they wish they had been more virtuous, and that desire can give them a keen sense of the enormity of their sin. Closely linked to this feeling is the fear of becoming a pariah of the herd. A man who cheats at cards or who does not pay his debts of honor has nothing within himself to face the disapproval of the herd when he is found out. He thus distinguishes himself from the religious innovator, the anarchist, and the revolutionary who feel that, whatever their present fate, the future is with them, and they will be honored as much as they are abhorred in the present. These men, despite the hostility of the herd, do not feel sinful, but a man who fully accepts the morality of the herd while acting against it suffers from great unhappiness. When he loses the caste and the fear of this disaster, or the pain when it occurs, it can easily lead him to consider his own acts as sinful. But the sense of sin, in its most important forms, is something deeper, something that has its roots in the unconscious and does not manifest in consciousness as a fear of disapproval from others. In consciousness, certain types of acts are labeled as sins without any visible reason for introspection. When a man commits these acts, he feels uncomfortable without really knowing why and wishes to be the kind of man who can abstain from what he believes to be a sin. He therefore morally admires only those he considers pure of heart and recognizes, with more or less regret, that it is not his lot to be a saint. In fact, his conception of holiness is probably one that is almost impossible to realize in everyday life. As a result, he traverses life with a sense of guilt, feeling that the best is not for him, and that his highest moments are those of tearful penance. The source of all this, in practically every case, is the moral teaching that the man received before the age of 6 from his mother or his nurse. Before this age, he learned that it is wrong to swear, and that it is not right to use language that is not the most appropriate for a gentleman, that only bad men drink, and that tobacco is incompatible with the highest virtue. He learned that he should never lie, and above all, he learned that any interest in sexual matters is an abomination. He knew that these were his mother's opinions, and believed that these were also the opinions of his Creator. Being affectionately treated by his mother, or in cases of neglect by his nurse, was the greatest pleasure of his life, and this was only obtained when he did not know that he had sinned against the moral code. He therefore came to associate something vaguely horrible with any behavior that his mother or nurse disapproved of. Gradually, as he grew up, he forgot where his moral code came from and what the original punishment for disobedience had been. But he did not abandon the moral code, nor cease to feel that something horrible could happen to him if he transgressed it. However, a large part of the childhood moral teaching lacks any rational foundation and cannot be applied to the ordinary behavior of common men. For example, a man who uses what are called bad words is not, from a rational point of view, worse than a man who does not. Yet almost everyone, when trying to imagine a saint, considers abstaining from swearing as essential. In light of reason, this is simply absurd. The same goes for alcohol and tobacco. Regarding alcohol, the sentiment does not exist in southern countries, and in fact, there is an element of impiety about it, since it is known that our Lord and the Apostles drank wine. As for tobacco, it is easier to maintain a negative position, since all the great saints lived before its use became known. But here again, no rational argument is possible. The opinion that no saint would smoke ultimately rests on the idea that no saint would do something simply because it brings him pleasure. This ascetic element in ordinary morality has become almost unconscious, but it operates in all kinds of ways that render our moral code irrational. In a rational ethics, it would be commendable to give pleasure to anyone, even to oneself, as long as there is no pain in return for oneself or for others. The ideally virtuous man, if we had rid ourselves of asceticism, would be the one who allows the pleasure of all good things, as long as there is no bad consequence that outweighs the pleasure. Returning to the question of lying, I do not deny that there are too many lies in the world and that we should all be better if truthfulness increased. But I deny, as I believe any rational person must, that lying is unjustifiable under any circumstances. Once, while walking in the countryside, I saw a fox exhausted in the final stages of exhaustion trying to continue running. A few minutes later, I saw the hunters, who asked me if I had seen the fox, and I told them yes. They asked me where it had gone, and I lied to them. I do not believe I would have been a better man had I told the truth. But it is especially in the sexual realm that early moral teaching does harm. If a child has been conventionally raised by strict parents or nurses, the association between sin and sexual organs is so firmly established by the age of 6 that it is unlikely to disappear completely for the rest of his life. This suffering is, of course, reinforced by the Oedipus complex, as the most beloved woman in childhood is the one with whom all sexual freedoms are impossible. The result is that the adult man feels that women degrade with sex and cannot respect his wife if she has an aversion to sexual relations. However, a man whose wife is cold will be instinctively driven to seek instinctive satisfaction elsewhere. Yet his instinctive satisfaction, although he finds it momentarily, will be poisoned by feelings of guilt. So he will be unable to be happy in any relationship with any woman, whether in marriage or outside it. The same goes for the woman. If she has been raised with great insistence to be what is called pure, she instinctively holds back in sexual relations with her husband and fears to derive pleasure from them. However, today, women are much less inclined to this than they were 50 years ago, as I would say that currently, among educated people, the sexual life of men is more twisted and poisoned by a sense of sin than that of women. There is a growing awareness, although not from the authorities, of the evils of traditional sexual education. Regarding young children, the correct rule is simple. Until the child approaches puberty, he should receive no sexual moral teaching, and care should be taken to avoid instilling the idea that there is something disgusting in natural bodily functions. As the time approaches when it will be necessary to provide moral instruction, make sure that it is rational and that you can provide good reasons for each point you address. But this is not the education I want to talk about in this text. In this text, I am more concerned with what adults can do to minimize the harmful effects of reckless education that provokes an irrational sense of sin. The problem posed here is the same as that addressed in the previous chapters, namely the need to force the unconscious to take into account the rational beliefs that govern our conscious thought. Man should not be swept away by his moods, believing one thing at one moment and another at another. The feeling of sin is particularly prominent at moments when conscious will is weakened by fatigue, illness, alcohol, or any other cause. What a man feels in these moments, unless he is under the influence of alcohol, is supposed to be a revelation of his higher being. If he were sick, he would be a saint. But it is absurd to suppose that moments of weakness provide more insight than moments of strength. In moments of weakness, it is difficult to resist childish suggestions. There is no reason to consider these suggestions as preferable to the beliefs of the adult man when he is in full possession of his faculties. On the contrary, what a man believes deliberately with all his reason when he is vigorous should be for him the norm regarding what he should believe at all times. It is entirely possible to overcome the childish suggestions of the unconscious and even to change the perceptions of the unconscious by employing the appropriate technique. As soon as you begin to feel remorse for an act that your reason tells you is not wrong, examine the causes of your feelings of remorse and convince yourself in detail of their absurdity. Let your conscious beliefs be so vivid and emphatic that they make an impression on your unconscious strong enough to counteract the impressions left by your nurse or mother when you were a baby. Do not settle for an alternation between moments of rationality and moments of irrationality. Look closely at irrationality with the determination not to respect it and not to let it dominate you whenever it introduces into your consciousness thoughts or feelings that are senseless. Root them out, examine them, and reject them. Do not allow yourself to remain a wavering creature, torn between reason and childish madness. Do not fear irreverence towards the memory of those who controlled your childhood. They seemed strong and wise to you then because you were weak and foolish. Now that you are neither, it is your duty to examine their apparent strength and wisdom to determine whether it deserves the reverence that, through force of habit, you continue to grant them. Ask yourself seriously whether the world is better because of the moral teaching traditionally given to the young. Consider how much unaltered superstition enters into the makeup of the conventionally virtuous man, and reflect on the fact that, while all sorts of imaginary moral dangers were protected by incredibly absurd prohibitions, the real moral dangers to which an adult is exposed were hardly mentioned. What are the truly harmful acts to which the average man is tempted? Sudden harshness in business, the type not punished by law, cruelty to employees, harshness towards one's wife and children, malice towards competitors, ferocity in political conflicts. These are the truly harmful sins that are common among respectable and respected citizens. Through these sins, a man spreads misery in his immediate circle and contributes to the destruction of civilization. Yet it is not these things that make him see himself as a pariah when he is ill, having lost all claim to divine favor, nor those that make him see in nightmares visions of his mother giving him reproachful looks, because his subconscious morality is thus separated from reason. Because the ethics believed in by those who had charge of his childhood were absurd, as they did not stem from any study of the individual's duties towards the community, because they were made up of old pieces of irrational taboos and contained within them elements of morbidity stemming from the spiritual disease that affected the dying Roman Empire. Our nominal morality was formulated by priests and mentally enslaved women. It is time for men who must take a normal part in the normal life of the world to learn to rebel against this morbid sense. And if the rebellion is to succeed in bringing individual happiness and allowing man to live coherently according to a norm, it is necessary that he thinks and feels deeply what his reason tells him. Most men, when they have superficially detached themselves from the superstitions of their childhood, think there is nothing more to do. They do not realize that these superstitions continue to lurk beneath the surface. When a rational conviction is reached, it is necessary to insist on it, to follow its consequences, to search within oneself for any unconscious belief associated with the new conviction that could otherwise survive. And when the feeling of sin becomes strong, as it will from time to time, treat it not as a revelation and a call to higher things, but as an illness and a weakness, unless, of course, it is caused by an act that a rational ethics would consider as such. I do not suggest that a man should be devoid of morality. I only suggest that he should be devoid of superstitious morality, which is something very different. Even when a man has offended his own rational code, I doubt that the feeling of sin is the best means of attaining a better form of life. The feeling of sin is something abject, something that lacks self-esteem. The loss of self-respect has never done anyone any good. The rational man will consider his own undesirable acts, just like those of others, as acts produced by certain circumstances that must be avoided, either through a better understanding of their undesirable nature or, when possible, by avoiding the circumstances that caused them. In reality, the feeling of sin, far from being a cause of a good life, is the opposite. It makes a man unhappy and makes him feel inferior. And being unhappy, he is likely to make excessive demands on others, preventing him from enjoying happiness in personal relationships. Feeling inferior, he will harbor resentment towards those who seem superior, find it difficult to admire and easy to envy. He will generally become unpleasant and find himself increasingly alone. An expansive and generous attitude towards others not only brings happiness to others, but is also an immense source of happiness for its possessor, as it generally makes him appreciated. But such an attitude is hardly possible for a man tormented by the feeling of sin. It is the result of assurance and self-confidence. It requires what might be called mental integration, that is to say, the different layers of human nature, conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, work together harmoniously and are not in perpetual battle. Producing such harmony is possible in most cases through wise education, but where education has been reckless, it is an even more difficult process, and this is what psychoanalysts attempt. However, I believe that in many cases the patient can accomplish the work himself, which in more extreme cases requires the help of the expert. Do not say, "I don't have time for such psychological tasks. My life is busy and full of affairs, and I must let my unconscious do its rounds." Nothing diminishes, not only regarding happiness but also regarding effectiveness. Like a personality divided against itself, the time spent producing harmony among the different parts of the personality is well spent. I suggest that a man should dedicate, for example, 1 hour a day to self-examination, because in my opinion, this is absolutely not the best method, as it increases introspection, which is part of the illness to be cured, given that a harmonious personality is directed outward. What I suggest is that a man must firmly decide what he rationally believes and must never allow opposing irrational beliefs to pass unchallenged or gain dominance over him. Even briefly, it involves reasoning with oneself in moments when one is tempted to become childish again. But reasoning, if sufficiently emphatic, can be very brief. Therefore, the time dedicated must be insignificant. Many people have an aversion to rationality, and where this exists, the things I have mentioned will seem irrelevant and unimportant. There is the idea that rationality, if allowed, will annihilate all the deepest emotions. This belief seems to stem from a completely erroneous conception of the function of reason in human life. It is not the role of reason to generate emotions, although it can be part of its function to discover ways to prevent these emotions from being an obstacle to well-being. Finding ways to minimize hate and envy is undoubtedly part of the function of rational psychology, but it is wrong to assume that by minimizing these passions, we will simultaneously reduce the strength of those passions that reason does not condemn. In passionate love, paternal affection, friendship, kindness, devotion to science or art, there is nothing that reason should want to diminish. The rational man, when he feels one or all of these emotions, will rejoice in feeling them and will do nothing to lessen their intensity, as all these emotions are part of the good life, that is to say, the life that generates happiness for oneself as well as for others. There is nothing irrational in passions as such, and many irrational people feel only the most trivial passions. No man should fear that by becoming rational, he will make his life boring. On the contrary, since rationality mainly consists of internal harmony, the man who attains it is freer in his contemplation of the world and in the use of his energies to achieve external goals than the man perpetually hindered by internal conflicts. Nothing is as boring as being locked in oneself. Nothing is as stimulating as having one's attention and energy directed outward. Our traditional morality has been unduly centered on the self, so that the conception of sin is part of this reckless focusing of attention on the self. For those who have never gone through the subjective states of mind induced by this defective morality, reason may be superfluous. But for those who have once acquired the illness, reason is necessary to effect a cure, and perhaps illness is a necessary step in mental development. I tend to think that the man who has overcome it with the help of reason has reached a higher level than the man who has never known either illness or healing. The hatred of reason, common in our time, is largely due to the fact that the operations of reason are not conceived in a sufficiently fundamental way. The man divided against himself seeks excitement and distraction. He loves strong passions not for solid reasons, but because they, for the moment, take him out of himself and avoid the painful need for reflection. Every passion is for him a form of intoxication, and since he cannot conceive fundamental happiness, any relief from pain seems to him possible only in the form of intoxication. However, this is a symptom of a deep illness. When this discomfort does not exist, the greatest happiness comes with the most complete possession of faculties. It is in the moments when the mind is most active and least forgetful that one experiences the most intense joys. Indeed, this is one of the best indicators of happiness. Happiness that requires intoxication belongs to a deceptive and unsatisfactory type. Truly satisfying happiness is accompanied by the complete exercise of our faculties and the fullest understanding of the world in which we live. Paranoia, in its most extreme forms, is a recognized form of madness. Some people imagine that others wish to kill them, imprison them, or harm them. Often the desire to protect themselves from these imaginary persecutors leads them to commit acts of violence that require restricting their freedom. This, like many other forms of madness, is merely an exaggeration of a tendency not rare among those considered normal. I do not propose to discuss extreme forms, which are matters for psychiatrists. It is the lighter forms that I wish to examine, as they are a very frequent cause of unhappiness, and not having yet produced definitive madness, can still be treated by the patient himself, provided he can be prompted to correctly diagnose his problem and see that its origin lies within himself and not in the supposed hostility or lack of kindness from others. We are all familiar with the type of person, man or woman, who, according to their own account, is perpetually a victim of ingratitude, lack of kindness, and betrayal. These people are often extraordinarily plausible and gain the warm sympathy of those who have not known them for long. In general, there is nothing inherently improbable in each of the stories they tell. The type of mistreatment they complain about undoubtedly occurs. What ultimately raises the listener's suspicions is the multiplicity of villains with whom the person has had the misfortune to encounter. According to the doctrine of probability, it is likely that different people living in a given society experience approximately the same amount of mistreatment throughout their lives. If a person from a given group receives, according to their own account, universal mistreatment, It is most probable that the cause lies within themselves, and that they are either imagining wounds they have not actually suffered or behaving unconsciously in a way that provokes uncontrollable irritation. Thus, experienced individuals become suspicious of what they are invariably told about being mistreated by the world. They tend, through their lack of sympathy, to confirm these unfortunate individuals in their opinion that everyone is against them. The problem is indeed difficult to address because it is exacerbated by both sympathy and a lack of sympathy. The person prone to paranoia, when they find that a story of misfortune is believed, will embellish it to the point of credibility. On the other hand, when they discover that their account is not believed, they simply have another example of their particularity. The hardness of man's heart toward himself is an illness that can only be treated by understanding, and this understanding must be conveyed to the patient if it is to serve its purpose. My goal in this chapter is to suggest a few general reflections through which each individual can detect in themselves the elements of paranoia that almost everyone suffers from to some degree or another, and, once detected, can eliminate them. This is an important part of the conquest of happiness, as it is utterly impossible to be happy if we feel that everyone is mistreating us. One of the universal forms of irrationality is the attitude that almost everyone adopts toward malicious gossip. Very few people can resist saying malicious things about their acquaintances, and sometimes even about their friends. However, when people discover that something negative has been said about them, they fill with indignation. It seems to them that it has never occurred to them that, just as they gossip about others, everyone else gossips about them. This is a mild form of the attitude that, when exaggerated, leads to paranoia. We hope that all others feel toward us that tender love and deep respect that we feel toward ourselves. We do not realize that we cannot expect others to think better of us than we think of them, and the reason this does not occur to us is that our own merits seem great and evident, while those of others, if they exist, are visible only to a very charitable eye. When you hear that someone has said something horrible about you, you remember the 99 times you refrained from making the most just and deserved criticism against them, and you forget the 100th time when, in a moment of negligence, you stated what you believed to be the truth about them. Is this the reward for all your long tolerance? However, from the other person's perspective, your behavior seems exactly what theirs seems to you. They know nothing of the times you did not speak. They only know of the 100th time you did. If we could all, by magic, read the thoughts of others, I suppose the first effect would be that almost all friendships would dissolve. The second effect, however, could be excellent. Indeed, a world without friends would be felt as intolerable, and we would learn to love ourselves without needing a veil of illusion to hide from ourselves that we do not consider ourselves absolutely perfect. We know that our friends have their faults, and yet they are generally pleasant people we appreciate. However, it seems intolerable to us that they have the same attitude toward us. We hope they think that, unlike the rest of humanity, we have no faults. When we are forced to admit that we have faults, we take this obvious fact too seriously. No one should expect to be perfect, nor should they worry excessively about not being so. Paranoia always originates from an exaggerated conception of our own merits. For example, let's assume that I am a playwright. For any impartial observer, it should be obvious that I am the brightest playwright of the era. Yet for some reason my works are rarely performed, and when they are not successful. What is the explanation for this strange situation? Obviously, directors, actors, and critics have conspired against me for one reason or another. The reason is, of course, very creditable. I have refused to bow to the great figures of the theatrical world. I have not flattered the critics. My works contain domestic truths that are unbearable for those they strike. Thus, my transcendent merit goes unrecognized. Then there is the inventor who has never managed to have the merits of his invention examined. Manufacturers cling to their habits and consider no innovation. Those who are progressive maintain their own inventories and manage to reject the instructions of unauthorized genius. Scientific societies strangely lose manuscripts or return them unread. The individuals who are approached are inexplicably insensitive. How can this situation be explained? It seems that there exists a corporation of men who wish to share the profits from the invention. The man who does not belong to this corporation will not be listened to. Then there is the man who has a genuine grievance based on real facts, but generalizes from his experience and comes to the conclusion that his own misfortune holds the key to the universe. Let's assume he discovers a scandal concerning the secret services that the government wishes to keep under wraps. He barely gets publicity for his discovery, and the apparently most arrogant men refuse to lift a finger to remedy the wrong that outrages him. So far, the facts are as he describes them, but his excesses have so impressed him that he believes all-powerful men are entirely and exclusively occupied with covering up the crimes that grant them their power. Cases of this type are particularly stubborn due to the partial truth of their perspective. What has personally affected them has naturally caused them a much greater impression than the number of cases to which they have not had direct experience. This gives them a false sense of proportion and makes them attach excessive importance to facts that may be more exceptional than typical. Another not uncommon victim of paranoia is a certain type of philanthropist who always does good for people against their will and is astonished and horrified by their lack of gratitude. On several occasions, our motives for doing good are not as pure as we imagine. The love of power is insidious. It has many disguises and is often the source of the pleasure we derive from doing what we believe to be good for others. It is not uncommon for another element to come into play. Doing good for people generally involves depriving them of certain pleasures, such as alcohol, gambling, idleness, or something else. In this case, there is a typical element of a large part of social morality, namely the envy of those who are in a position to commit sins from which we must abstain if we want to maintain the respect of our friends. Those who vote, for example, for a law against cigarette consumption are obviously non-smokers for whom the pleasure others derive from tobacco is a source of pain. If they expect former smokers to thank them for freeing them from this detestable vice, they may be disappointed. Then they may start to reflect that they have given their lives for the public good, and that those who have the most reason to be grateful to them seem to be the least aware of any occasion for gratitude. In the past, housewives had the same attitude toward the servants whose morals they safeguarded. But nowadays, the issue of servants has become so sharpened that this form of kindness toward maids has become less common in high political spheres. The same phenomenon occurs. The statesman who has gradually concentrated all power in himself to pursue lofty and noble goals, abandoning comfort to enter the arena of life, is astonished by the people's ingratitude when they turn against him. It never occurs to him that his work might have a motive other than public interest, or that the pleasure of controlling affairs might have inspired his activities to some extent. The usual phrases about the court and in the party press seem to him to express truths, and he confuses partisan rhetoric with a genuine analysis of motives. Disgusted and disillusioned, he withdraws from the world after the world has withdrawn from him, and regrets having once attempted such an thankless task as the search for the public good. These illustrations suggest 4 general maxims that turn out to be an adequate prevention of paranoia if one takes sufficient account of their truth. The first is, remember that your motives are not always as altruistic as they seem to you. The second is, do not overestimate your own merits. The third is, do not expect others to care about you as much as you do yourself. And the fourth is, do not imagine that the majority of people care enough about you to want to persecute you. I will say a few words about each of these maxims. The suspicion of one's own motives is particularly necessary for philanthropists and executives. These people have a vision of what the world or part of it should be, and they sometimes feel, rightly or wrongly, that by realizing their vision they bring a blessing to humanity or a sector of it. However, they do not always realize that the individuals affected by their actions each have the same right to their own opinion about the type of world they desire. An executive-type man is very sure that his vision is the right one and that any contrary vision is wrong, but his subjective certainty offers no objective proof that he is right. Moreover, his belief is very often a camouflage for the power he gains by being the cause of changes. In addition to the love of power, there is another motive, vanity, which plays an important role in these cases. The ambitious idealist who presents himself in Parliament, and I speak from experience, is astonished by himself and the electorate, assuming that he only desires the glory of adding more letters MP after his name. When the campaign is over and he has time to reflect, he wonders if, after all, the cynical voters were right. Idealism often causes simple motives to take on strange disguises, and consequently, a touch of realistic cynicism is not too much among our public men. Conventional morality instills a degree of altruism to which human nature can barely respond, and those who take pleasure in their virtue often imagine that they attain this unattainable idea. The vast majority of actions, even among the noblest people, have selfish motives, and one should not be disheartened by this. Indeed, if it were otherwise, the human race could not survive. A man who devoted himself to feeding others while forgetting to feed himself would perish. He can, of course, feed himself solely to gain the strength necessary to fight against evil, but it is doubtful that food ingested for this motive can be properly digested, as the flow of saliva would be insufficiently stimulated. Therefore, it is preferable for a man to eat because he enjoys his food, rather than to make his meals a purely altruistic act inspired by a desire for the public good. What applies to food applies to everything else. Anything one wishes to do can only be well done with a certain zeal, and zeal is difficult without a self-referential motive. I must include among the motives of self-esteem, from a biological point of view, those that concern biologically related individuals, such as the desire to defend one's wife and children against enemies. This degree of altruism is part of normal human nature, but the degree instilled by conventional ethics is not and is rarely authentically achieved. People who wish to have a high opinion of their own moral excellence must persuade themselves that they have reached a degree of altruism that they are very unlikely to have actually attained. Hence the reinforcement by holiness, which is often linked to a self-illusion that can easily lead to paranoia. The second of our maxims, in the sense that it is unwise to overestimate one's own merits, is covered regarding morality by what we have already said. But one should also not overestimate merits that are not moral. The playwright whose works are never successful should calmly consider the hypothesis that his works are bad. He should not dismiss them outright as obviously untenable. If he finds that the hypothesis corresponds to the facts, he should, as an inductive philosopher, adopt it. Certainly in history there are cases of unrecognized merit, but they are far fewer than cases of recognized demerit. A genius whose name is not recognized in his time does well to persist in his path, despite the lack of recognition. But if it turns out he is a person without talent and inflated with vanity, he would do well not to persist. It is impossible to know to which category belongs someone who is afflicted by the impulse to produce unrecognized masterpieces. If one belongs to one category, persistence is heroic. If one belongs to the other, it is ridiculous. When you have been dead for 100 years, it will be impossible to guess to which category you belonged. In the meantime, there is a test, perhaps not infallible but of considerable value, that you can apply yourself. If you suspect that you are a genius while your friends suspect that you are not, the test is this. Do you produce because you feel an urgent need to express certain ideas or feelings, or are you motivated by the desire for applause? In the authentic artist, the desire for applause, although it often exists strongly, is secondary in the sense that the artist wishes to produce a certain type of work and hopes that this work will be applauded, but this does not alter his style, even if he does not receive applause. The man, on the other hand, for whom the desire for applause is the main motive, lacks the inner strength that drives him toward a particular type of expression, and could just as easily do a totally different type of work. This man, if he fails to gain applause with his art, would do better to give up. In general terms, whatever his path, if you find that others do not value your skills as positively as you do not be too sure that they are wrong. If you allow yourself to think this way, you may easily fall into the belief that there is a conspiracy to prevent recognition of your merits, and this belief is surely the source of an unhappy life. Recognizing that your merit is not as great as you had hoped can be painful for a time, but it is a pain that has an end, beyond which a happy life becomes possible again. Our third maxim was not to expect too much from others. It was customary for invalid ladies to expect that at least one of their daughters would sacrifice herself entirely as a nurse, even going so far as to renounce marriage. This is to expect from another person a degree of altruism that is contrary to reason, since the loss for the altruist is greater than the gain for the egoist. In all your relationships with others, especially with those closest and dearest to you, it is important, and not always easy, to remember that they see life from their own angle, and as it touches their own ego, not yours. One should not expect someone to distort the main lines of their life for the good of another individual. Sometimes there may be such affection that even the greatest sacrifices become natural, but if they are not, they should not be made, and no one should be considered guilty for not making them. Very often, the behavior that people complain about in others is merely the healthy reaction of natural selfishness against the greed of a person whose ego extends beyond its own limits. The fourth maxim we mentioned is to realize that others spend less time thinking about you than you do about yourself. The victim of paranoia imagines that all sorts of people, who in reality have their own occupations and interests, are occupied morning, noon, and night trying to harm the poor lunatic. Likewise, the relatively rational victim of paranoia sees all types of actions as references to herself, which do not actually exist. This idea is, of course, flattering to her vanity. If she were a sufficiently great person, it might be true. For many years, the actions of the British government were primarily focused on thwarting Napoleon, but when a minor person imagines that others think of him perpetually, he is on the path to madness. If you give a speech, say at a public dinner, photographs and some of the other speakers appear in the illustrated newspapers. But there is no photo of you. How can this be explained? Obviously, because the other speakers are considered more important. It must be because the editors of the newspapers ordered your omission. And why would they have given these orders? Obviously because they feared you due to your great importance. Thus the omission of your image turns into an affront or a subtle compliment. But such self-illusion cannot lead to any solid happiness. Deep down in your mind you will know that the facts are different, and to hide this as much as possible, you will have to invent increasingly fanciful hypotheses. The attention to try to believe these hypotheses will ultimately be very great. And since they also involve the belief that you are the object of widespread hostility, they protect your self-esteem only by inflicting upon you the very painful sensation of being at odds with the world. No happiness based on self-illusion is solid, and as unpleasant as it may be, it is better to face the truth once and for all. Get used to it, and build your life in accordance with it. The fear of public opinion. Very few people can be happy if their lifestyle and worldview are not generally approved by those with whom they have social relationships, and especially by those with whom they live. A peculiarity of modern communities is that they are divided into groups that differ profoundly in their morals and beliefs. This situation began with the Reformation, or perhaps we should say with the Renaissance, and has intensified since then. There were Protestants and Catholics who differed not only in theology, but also in many other practical matters. There were aristocrats who allowed various types of actions that were not tolerated among the bourgeoisie. Then came the latitudinarians and free-thinkers who did not recognize the duties of religious observance. Nowadays, across the European continent, there is a profound division between socialists and others, covering not only politics but almost all aspects of life. In English-speaking countries, the divisions are very numerous. In some circles, art is admired, while in others, it is considered futile, especially if it is modern. In some circles, devotion to the empire is the supreme virtue, while in others, it is considered a vice, and in still others, a form of stupidity. Conventional people consider adultery one of the worst crimes, yet large sectors of the population view it as excusable, even positively commendable. Among Catholics, divorce is completely forbidden, while most non-Catholics accept it as a necessary relief from marriage. Because of all these differences in perspective, a person with particular tastes and beliefs may find themselves practically marginalized in one group, even though they are accepted as an entirely ordinary human being in another group. A great amount of unhappiness, especially among the young, arises in this way. A young man or woman perceives the ideas that float in the air in one way or another, but finds these ideas to be anathema in the particular environment where they live. Young people easily feel that the only environment they know is representative of everyone, and they struggle to believe that in another place or group, the opinions they dare not confess for fear of being considered utterly perverse would be accepted as commonplaces of the time. Thus, due to ignorance of the world, a great amount of unnecessary misery is endured. Sometimes this misery is confined to youth, but it is not uncommon for it to last a lifetime. This isolation is not only a source of pain, It also leads to a significant dissipation of energy in the useless task of maintaining mental independence against a hostile environment. And in 99 cases out of 100, it generates a certain timidity in following ideas to their logical conclusions. The Bronte sisters never encountered people who shared their ideas before the publication of their books. This did not affect Emily, who was heroic and grand, but it certainly affected Charlotte, whose perspective, despite her talents, remained largely that of a governess. Blake, much like Emily, lived in extreme mental isolation, but like her, he was great enough to overcome its harmful effects, never doubting that he was right and that his critics were wrong. His attitude toward public opinion was expressed in clear terms. The only man I ever knew who did not almost make me want to vomit was Fuseli. He was both Turkish and Jewish, and so, dear Christian friends, how do they do it? But few people possess this degree of strength in their inner life. For almost everyone, a sympathetic environment is necessary to be happy. For the majority, of course, the environment in which they find themselves is congenial. They absorb the current prejudices in their youth and instinctively adapt to the beliefs and customs they find around them. But for a large minority, which practically includes all those with intellectual or artistic merit, this attitude is, in essence, impossible. A person born, say, in a small rural town, finds herself surrounded from youth by hostility toward what is necessary for mental excellence. If she wishes to read books, other young people despise them, and teachers tell her that these works are disturbing. If she is interested in art, her contemporaries consider it unmanly, and her elders deem it immoral. If she wishes to pursue a career, however respectable, that has not been common in her circle, she is told that she is self-incriminating, and that what was good enough for her father should be good enough for her too. If she shows a tendency to criticize the religious principles and political afflictions of her parents, she risks getting into serious trouble. For all these reasons, for most young people of exceptional merit, adolescence is a time of great unhappiness. For their more ordinary peers, it may be a time of joy and entertainment, but for them, they desire something more serious than they can find, as long as their elders or contemporaries, in the particular social environment where fate has made them born. When these young people go to university, they likely discover kindred souls and enjoy a few years of great happiness. If they are lucky, they may, upon leaving university, obtain a job that still gives them the opportunity to choose sympathetic companions. An intelligent man living in a large city like London or New York can generally find a congenial group where it is not necessary to practice any constraint or hypocrisy. But if his work forces him to live in a smaller place, especially if he must maintain the respect of ordinary people, as in the case of a doctor or lawyer, he may find himself, throughout his life, practically obliged to hide his true tastes and beliefs from the majority of the people he interacts with in his daily life. This is particularly true in America due to the vastness of the country. In the most unlikely places, north, south, east, or west, there are solitary individuals who know from books that there are places where they are not alone, but they have neither the opportunity to live in such places nor the rare chance for pleasant conversation. True happiness in such circumstances is impossible for those who are built on a less magnificent scale than Blake and Emily Bronte. For it to be possible, one must find a way to diminish or avoid the tyranny of public opinion and allow the members of the intellectual minority to know each other and enjoy the company of others. In many cases, unnecessary timidity exacerbates the problem more than necessary, as public opinion is always more tyrannical toward those who manifestly fear it than toward those who feel indifferent to it. A dog barks louder and bites more easily when people are afraid of it than when they treat it with disdain. The human pack has something of this same characteristic. If you show that you are afraid, you promise a good home, whereas if you show indifference, they begin to doubt their own power and tend to leave you alone. I obviously do not think of extreme forms of defiance. If someone expresses views in California that are conventional in Russia, or in Russia views that are conventional in California, they must accept the consequences. I do not mean such extremes, but rather much lighter deviations from conventionality, such as not dressing properly, not belonging to a church, or refraining from reading intelligent books. Such deviations, if made with joy and carefreeness, not provocatively but spontaneously, will eventually be tolerated even in the most conventional society. Gradually, it is possible to acquire the position of madman with permission, to whom things are allowed that would be considered unforgivable in another. This largely depends on a certain good nature and kindness. Conventional people become very angry when someone deviates from conventions, as they view such deviations as a criticism of themselves. They will forgive many failures of conformity in a man who possesses enough joy and sympathy to clarify even to the most foolish. However, this method of escaping censure is impossible for many whose tastes or opinions place them outside the sympathy of the herd. Their lack of sympathy makes them uncomfortable and drives them to adopt a combative attitude, even if they conform externally or manage to avoid any acute questioning. Therefore, individuals who are not in harmony with the conventions of their own group tend to be prickly, uncomfortable, and lacking in expansive good humor. These same individuals, transported to another group where their viewpoint is not considered strange, seem to change completely in character. From serious, shy, and distracted individuals, they can become cheerful and self-assured. From angular people, they can become gentle and easygoing, and from egocentric individuals, they can become sociable and extroverted. Thus, as much as possible, young people who find themselves in disagreement with their environment should strive to choose a profession that gives them the opportunity to have pleasant company, even if this entails a considerable loss. They often barely know that this is possible, as their knowledge of the world is very limited, and they easily imagine that the prejudices they have become accustomed to at home are universal. This is an area where older individuals should be able to offer significant help to the young, as considerable experience of humanity is essential. It is common nowadays with psychoanalysis to assume that when a young person is not in harmony with their environment, the cause must lie in a psychological disorder. In my opinion, this is a complete mistake. Suppose, for example, that a young person has parents who believe that the theory of evolution is perverse. In this case, it takes only intelligence not to sympathize with them. Disagreeing with the environment is indeed an unfortunate circumstance, but it is not always an unfortunate circumstance to be avoided at all costs, especially when the environment is stupid, prejudiced, or cruel. It is a sign of merit to disagree with it, and to a certain extent these characteristics exist in almost all environments. Galileo and Kepler had dangerous thoughts, as they are called in Japan, and the most intelligent men known today had them too. It is undesirable for social sense to be so strongly developed that these men fear the social hostility that their opinions might provoke. What is desirable is to find a way to make this hostility as light and ineffective as possible. In the modern world, the most important part of this problem arises during youth. If a man once embarks on the correct career and in the appropriate environment, he can, in most cases, escape social persecution. But as long as he is young and his merits have not yet been proven, he is exposed to being at the mercy of other ignorant individuals who believe themselves capable of judging matters they do not understand, and who are outraged at the idea that someone so young could know more than they do with all their worldly experience. Many individuals who ultimately escaped the tyranny of ignorance had such a tough struggle and such a long period of repression that they became bitter and their energy is exhausted. There is the comforting doctrine that genius will always find a way, and by virtue of this doctrine, many people believe that the persecution of youthful talent cannot cause much harm. But there is no reason to accept this notion. It is like the theory that murder will find a way. Obviously, all the murders we know of have been discovered, but who knows how many there may be that we have never heard of. Similarly, all the men of genius we have known triumphed over adverse circumstances, but this does not mean that there have not been countless others who succumbed in their youth. Moreover, it is not only about genius but also about talent, which is also necessary for the community. And it is not just about emerging in one way or another, but also about emerging without obstacles with intact energy. Therefore, taking into account all these reasons, the path of youth should not be made too difficult. While it is desirable for older individuals to treat the desires of the young with respect, it is not desirable for the young to treat the desires of older individuals with respect. The reason is simple. In both cases, it is about the lives of the young, not those of the old. When young people attempt to regulate the lives of older individuals, for example, by opposing a widowed father remarrying, They are just as mistaken as the elderly who try to regulate the lives of the young. Both the old and the young, once they reach the age of discretion, have the right to their own choices and, consequently, to their own mistakes. Young people are poorly advised and yield to the pressure of the older generation in any vital matter. Suppose, for example, that you are a young person who wishes to go on stage and your parents oppose your desire, either because the stage is immoral or because it is socially inferior. They may exert all sorts of pressures, telling you that they will disown you if you ignore their orders, saying that you will surely regret it in a few years, mentioning a whole series of horrible examples of young people who were reckless enough to do what you are contemplating and met with dire ends as a result. Of course, they may be right in thinking that the stage is not the career for you. You may not have a talent for acting, or you may have a poor voice. However, if that is the case, you will soon discover it through people in the theatre, and there will still be plenty of time to pursue a different career. The arguments of parents should not be a sufficient reason to give up your attempt. If despite everything you are told, you pursue your intention, you will manage to reason much sooner than either you or they suppose. If, on the contrary, the opinion of professionals discourages you, that is another matter, as the opinion of professionals should always be respected by newcomers. I believe that, in general, apart from the views of experts, too much respect is given to the opinions of others, both in great matters and in small ones. Public opinion should be respected to the extent necessary to avoid hunger and not go to prison, but anything beyond that is a voluntary submission to unnecessary tyranny and risks harming happiness in various ways. Let's take, for example, the issue of spending. Many people spend their money in ways that are very different from what their natural tastes would recommend, simply because they feel that the respect of their neighbors depends on their possession of a good car and their ability to host nice dinners. In fact, any man who can clearly afford a car but genuinely prefers travel or a good library will be much more respected if he behaves exactly like everyone else. Of course, it makes no sense to deliberately mock public opinion, as it remains under his influence, albeit in a reversed manner. But being truly indifferent to this opinion is a strength and a source of happiness. A society made up of men and women who do not bend too much to conventions is a much more interesting society than one where everyone behaves in the same way, where the character of each person develops individually, differences are preserved, and it is worth meeting new people because they are not mere replicas of those already known. This was one of the advantages of aristocracy, as where status depended on birth, erratic behavior was permitted. In the modern world, we are losing this source of social freedom, and it is therefore desirable to have a more deliberate awareness of the dangers of uniformity. I do not mean that people should be intentionally eccentric, which is just as uninteresting as being conventional. I simply mean that people should be natural and follow their spontaneous tastes, as long as these are not definitively antisocial. In the modern world, due to the speed of transportation, people depend less than before on their geographic or close neighbors. Those with a car can consider anyone living within a 20-mile radius as neighbors. They thus have much greater power than before to choose their companions. In a populous neighborhood, a man must be very unlucky if he does not find kindred spirits within a 20-mile radius. The idea that one must know one's immediate neighbors has faded in large population centers, but persists in small towns and the countryside. It has become a nonsensical idea, as it is not necessary to rely on immediate neighbors for socialization. It is increasingly possible to choose our companions based on intellectual affinity rather than mere proximity. Happiness is favored by associations of people with similar tastes and opinions. One can hope that social relationships will increasingly develop in this direction, and that through these means, the loneliness that currently afflicts so many unconventional people will gradually diminish until it almost disappears. This would undoubtedly increase their happiness, but it would decrease the sadistic pleasure that conventional people currently derive from holding nonconformists at their mercy. However, I do not believe this is a pleasure we should preserve. The fear of public opinion, like any other form of fear, is oppressive and hinders growth. It is difficult to achieve any form of greatness as long as such fear remains strong, and it is impossible to acquire that freedom of spirit which constitutes true happiness, as it is essential for happiness that our way of life comes from our own deep impulses and not from the accidental tastes and desires of those who happen to be our neighbors or close ones. The fear of immediate neighbors is undoubtedly less than it used to be, but there is a new form of fear, the fear of what the newspapers might say. This is as terrifying as anything related to the medieval witch hunts. When newspapers choose a scapegoat, perhaps a person who is quite harmless, the results can be very serious. Fortunately, so far, this fate is one from which the majority of people escape, thanks to their obscurity. But as publicity perfects its methods, there will be a growing danger in this new form of social persecution. This is too serious a matter to be treated with disdain by the individual who is its victim, and whatever one may think of the great principle of freedom of the press, I believe it will be necessary to draw the line more clearly than current defamation laws do. It will also be necessary to prohibit anything that makes life intolerable for innocent individuals, even if this results in malicious publications that may render them unpopular. The only definitive remedy to this evil, however, is an increase in public tolerance. The best way to increase tolerance is to multiply the number of individuals who experience true happiness, and who therefore do not find their main pleasure in inflicting pain on their fellow beings. Causes of Happiness, Chapter 10. Is it possible to be happy? So far we have considered the unhappy man. We now have the more pleasant task of considering the happy man. From the conversations and books of some of my friends, it seems that happiness in the modern world has become impossible. However, I find that this opinion tends to dissipate with introspection, travel abroad, and conversations with my gardener. The unhappiness of my literary friends was not addressed in a previous chapter. In this chapter, I wish to review the happy people I have encountered throughout my life. Happiness divides into two types, although there are, of course, intermediate degrees. The two classes to which I refer could be distinguished as simple and fanciful, or animal and spiritual, or of the heart and of the mind. The choice of designation between these alternatives depends, of course, on the thesis one wishes to demonstrate. At this moment, I am not interested in demonstrating a thesis, but simply in describing. Perhaps the simplest way to describe the difference between the two classes of happiness is to say that one class is open to every human being, and the other only to those who know how to read and write. When I was a child, I met a man overflowing with happiness whose job was to dig wells. He was of enormous stature and incredible musculature. He could neither read nor write, and in 1885, when he obtained a vote for Parliament, he discovered for the first time the existence of such an institution. His happiness did not depend on intellectual sources. It was not based on belief in natural law, in the perfectibility of the species, in the public ownership of public services, nor on the final triumph of the Seventh-day Adventists, nor on any of the other creeds that intellectuals deem necessary for their enjoyment of life. It was based on physical vigor, the sufficiency of work, and the overcoming of non-insurmountable obstacles in the form of rocks. The happiness of my gardener is of the same nature. He wages a perpetual war against rabbits, about whom he talks exactly as Scotland talks about the Bolsheviks. He sees them as obscure and fierce machinations, and believes that only a trick equal to his can face them. Just like the heroes of Bajala, who spent their days hunting a certain wild boar they killed every night, only for it to miraculously come back to life in the morning, my gardener can kill his enemy one day without fearing it will disappear the next. Although he is over 70 years old, he works all day and bikes 16 miles to and from work. The inexhaustible source of his joy is the rabbits that provide it. But you might say that these simple pleasures are not within the reach of superior beings like us. What joy can we experience in waging war against creatures as insignificant as rabbits? In my opinion, the argument is poor. A rabbit is far larger than a yellow fever bacillus, and yet a person can still find happiness in waging war against the latter. The pleasures exactly similar to those of my gardener, in terms of their emotional content, are accessible to the most educated individuals. The difference that education makes manifests only in the activities. Thanks to school, these pleasures become accessible. The pleasures of achievement require difficulties, such that success seems doubtful from the outset, although one generally succeeds in the end. This is perhaps the main reason why a modest estimation of one's own faculties is a source of happiness. A man who underestimates himself is constantly surprised by success, while one who overestimates himself is often surprised by failure. The first type of surprise is pleasant. The second is unpleasant. It is therefore wise not to be excessively vain while avoiding being too modest to be enterprising. Among the most educated sectors of the community, the happiest today are scientists. Many of the most prominent in this field are emotionally simple and derive such deep satisfaction from their work that they can experience pleasure in eating and even in marrying. Artists and literati consider it their duty to be unhappy in their marriages, but scientists often remain capable of old-fashioned domestic happiness. The reason is that the upper parts of their intelligence are wholly absorbed in their work and do not mingle in areas where they have no functions to perform. In their work, they are happy because in the modern world, the sciences are progressive and powerful, and their importance is not questioned either by themselves or by the lay people. They do not, therefore, need complex emotions because the simplest emotions encounter no obstacles. The complexity of emotions is like the foam on a river. It occurs due to obstacles that break the smoothly flowing currents. But as long as vital energies are not impeded, they produce no rippling at the surface, and their strength is not evident to one who does not observe it. All the conditions of happiness are fulfilled in the life of the scientist. He has an activity that maximally utilizes his skills and produces results that seem significant, not only for himself, but for the public in general, even when the latter cannot understand them in any way. In this he is luckier than the artist, because when the public cannot understand a painting or a poem, it concludes that it is a bad work. But when it understands the theory of relativity, it rightly concludes that its education has been insufficient. As a result, Einstein is honored while the best painters have been or are left to starve in garrets. Thus, while Einstein is happy, the painters are unhappy. Very few men can be truly happy in a life that involves a continuous assertion against the skepticism of the mass of humanity. Unless they can withdraw into a sect and forget the outside world, the scientist does not need a sect, as everyone regards him well, except for his colleagues. The artist, on the other hand, finds himself in the painful position of having to choose between being despised and being despicable. Julius II, although he mistreated Michelangelo, never considered him incapable of painting. The modern millionaire, although he pours his wealth on aging artists after they have lost their talents, never imagines that their work is as important as his own. Perhaps these circumstances have something to do with why artists are, on average, less happy than scientists. I believe it must be acknowledged that the brightest young people in Western countries tend to experience this type of unhappiness that comes from not finding a suitable job for their best talents. However, this is not the case in Eastern countries. Intelligent young people today are probably happier in Russia than in any other part of the world. There they have a new world to create and a fervent faith to create it. The old have been executed, starved, exiled, or disinfected in other ways, so they cannot, as in all Western countries, force the young to choose between doing harm or doing nothing. To the Western sophisticate, the faith of the young Russian may seem rudimentary, but after all, what can one say against it? You create a new world, you like the new world, and once the new world is created, it is almost certainly happier for the average Russian than it was before the revolution. It may not be a world in which a sophisticated Western intellectual would be happy, but the sophisticated Western intellectual does not have to live there. Therefore, according to all pragmatic tests, the faith of young Russia is justified, and condemning it as rudimentary can have no other justification than theoretical. In India, China, and Japan, external political circumstances interfere with the happiness of young intellectuals, but there is no internal obstacle that exists in the West. There are activities that seem important to young people, and to the extent that these activities succeed, the young are happy. They feel that they have an important role to play in national life and goals to pursue that, although difficult, are not impossible to achieve. The cynicism frequently encountered among the most educated young Westerners is the result of a combination of convenience with powerlessness. Powerlessness makes people feel that it is not worth doing anything, and convenience makes the pain of this feeling simply bearable. In the East, the university student can expect to have more influence on public opinion than in modern West, but he has much less opportunity than in the West to ensure a substantial income. Thus, it is neither important nor comfortable to become a reformer or revolutionary, but it is possible not to become cynical. The happiness of the reformer or revolutionary depends on the course of public affairs, but probably even while being executed, he enjoys a greater real happiness than is possible for the comfortable cynic. I remember a young Chinese man who visited my school. He was going to establish a similar school in a reactionary part of China and hoped that the result would be that his head would be cut off. However, he enjoyed a tranquil happiness that I could only envy. I do not, however, want to suggest that these types of elevated happiness are the only possible ones. In fact, they are open only to a minority, as they require a type of capacity and a breadth of interest that cannot be common. It is not only prominent scientists who can find pleasure through work, nor distinguished statesmen who can derive pleasure from advocating a cause. The pleasure of work is open to anyone who can develop a specialized skill, as long as they can find satisfaction in exercising their skill without requiring universal applause. I met a man who lost the use of both his legs in his youth, but remained serenely happy throughout his long life. He achieved this by writing a 5-volume work on the care of roses, in which he was always considered the leading expert. I have not had the pleasure of knowing a large number of conchologists, but among those I have met, I always understood that the study of shells brought satisfaction to those who engaged in it. I also knew a man who was the best composer in the world and was sought after by all those dedicated to inventing artistic types. He derived his joy not so much from the true respect shown to him by people whose respect was not given lightly, but from the genuine pleasure that the exercise of his craft provided him, a pleasure not very different from that felt by good dancers while dancing. I have also known composers skilled in establishing types of mathematical notation, or cuneiform writing, or any other complex and difficult field. I discovered that if the private lives of these men were happy, then during their working hours, their creative instincts were fully satisfied. It is often said that in our age of machines, there is less room for the joy of the craftsman in specialized work. I'm not at all sure that this is true. The specialized worker today is indeed occupied by tasks very different from those performed by members of medieval guilds. But he remains very important and quite essential in the economy of machines. There are those who make scientific instruments and delicate machines, designers, airplane mechanics, drivers, and many others whose trade allows them to develop a skill to almost any level. The agricultural worker and the peasant in comparatively primitive communities do not seem, from what I have observed, as happy as a driver or mechanic. It is true that the work of a peasant cultivating his own land is varied, ploughing, sowing, and harvesting, but he is at the mercy of the elements and is very aware of his dependence, while the man working with a modern mechanism is conscious of power and acquires the feeling that man is the master, not the slave of natural forces. Of course, the work is very little interesting for the vast mass of simple machine attendants who repeat a mechanical operation over and over with a minimum of variation. But the less interesting the work, the more likely it is to be performed by a machine. The ultimate goal of mechanized production, which we are still very far from achieving, is a system where everything tedious is done by machines, and human beings are reserved for tasks involving variety and initiative. In such a world, work will be less tedious and depressing than it has been at any time since the advent of agriculture. By adopting agriculture, humanity chose to submit to monotony and boredom in order to reduce the risk of starving to death. When men obtained their food through hunting, work was a joy, as evidenced by the fact that the rich still pursue these ancestral occupations for pleasure. But with the introduction of agriculture, humanity entered a long period of pettiness, misery, and madness from which it is only now beginning to free itself through machinery. It is all well and good for sentimentalists to talk about contact with the land and the mature wisdom of Hardy's philosophical peasants. But the only desire of any young rural person is to find work in the cities where they can escape the slavery of the wind, the climate, and the solitude of dark winter evenings. In the reliable and human atmosphere of the factory, companionship and cooperation are essential elements of average happiness, and this is much more complete in industry than in agriculture. Believing in a cause is a source of happiness for many people. I am not only thinking of revolutionaries, socialists, and nationalists from oppressed countries, etc., but also of many types of more modest beliefs. The men I have known who believed that the English were the 10 lost tribes were almost always happy, while those who believed that the English were only the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh were extremely happy. I do not suggest that the listener adopt this belief, for I cannot advocate a happiness based on what seems to be false beliefs. For the same reason, I cannot urge the listener to believe that men must live exclusively on nuts, although to my knowledge this belief invariably ensures perfect happiness. It is nevertheless easy to find a cause that is not in any degree fantastic, and those whose interests in these causes are authentic find an occupation for their leisure and a complete antidote to the feeling that life is empty. Not very far from devotion to obscure causes is absorption in a hobby. One of the most prominent living mathematicians divides his time between mathematics and stamp collecting. I imagine that the latter provides him with comfort in moments when he cannot make progress in the former. The difficulty of proving propositions in number theory is not the only sorrow that stamp collecting can cure, nor are stamps the only things that can be collected. Consider the vast field of ecstasy that opens to the imagination when one thinks of ancient porcelain, tobacco boxes, Roman coins, arrowheads, and flint tools. It is true that many of us consider ourselves too superior to these simple pleasures. We all experience them in our childhood, but for some reason we judge them unworthy of an adult. This is a complete error. Any pleasure that does no harm to others should be appreciated. For my part, I collect rivers. I am happy to have descended the Volga and ascended the Langtse, and I regret never having seen the Amazon or the Orinoco. As simple as these emotions may be, I do not care. Consider again the passionate joy of the baseball enthusiast. He eagerly turns to his newspaper, and the radio provides him with the most vivid emotion. I remember meeting one of the leading writers in the United States for the first time, a man who, because of his books, I assumed was filled with melancholy. But it turned out that at that moment, the most crucial baseball results were coming in over the radio. He forgot everything, literature and all the other pains of our sublunar life, and shouted for joy when his favorites won. Since that incident, I have been able to read his books without feeling depressed by the misfortunes of his characters. But fashions and hobbies are often, and perhaps in most cases, not a fundamental source of happiness, but rather a means of escaping reality, temporarily forgetting a pain that is too difficult to confront. Fundamental happiness depends above all on what one might call a friendly interest in people and things. Friendly interest in people is a form of affection, but not the assertive and possessive kind that always seeks an emphatic response. The latter form is often a source of unhappiness. The type of affection that generates happiness is the one that loves to observe people and finds pleasure in their individual traits, one that wishes to embrace the interests and pleasures of those with whom they come into contact, without seeking to acquire power over them or to gain their enthusiastic admiration. Those whose attitude toward others is truly of this type will be a source of happiness and will receive mutual kindness. Their relationships with others, whether light or serious, will satisfy both their interests and affections. They will not be affected by ingratitude, as they will rarely suffer from it, and they will not notice it when it occurs. The same idiosyncrasy that would exasperate another to the point of nervousness will be for them a source of sweet diversion. They will effortlessly achieve results that for another man, after long struggles, would seem unattainable. By being happy in themselves, they will be pleasant companions, which in turn will increase their happiness. But all of this must be authentic. It must not arise from an idea of self-denial inspired by a sense of duty. The sense of duty is useful in work, but offensive in personal relationships. People wish to please, not to be endured with patient resignation. Pleasing many people spontaneously and effortlessly is perhaps the greatest source of personal happiness. I also spoke earlier about what I call a friendly interest in things. This phrase may seem forced. One might say it is impossible to feel friendship for things. However, there is something analogous to friendship in the type of interest a geologist has in rocks or an architect in ruins, and this interest should be an element of our attitude toward individuals or societies. It is possible to have an interest in things that is hostile rather than friendly. A man might collect data on spider habitats because he hates spiders and wants to live in a place where there are few of them. This type of interest would not provide the same satisfaction that the geologist derives from his rocks. Interest in impersonal things, while perhaps less valuable as an ingredient of daily happiness than a friendly activity toward our fellow beings, is still very important. The world is vast, and our own strengths are limited. If all our happiness is tied to our personal circumstances, it is hard not to demand more from life than it has to offer, and demanding too much is the surest way to obtain even less of what is possible. A man who can forget his worries through a genuine interest in, for example, the Council of Trent or the history of the stars' lives, will find that, When he returns from his excursion into the impersonal world, he has gained a serenity and calmness that allow him to manage his concerns better. In the meantime, he will have experienced true happiness, albeit temporary. The secret to happiness is this: let your interests be as wide as possible, and let your reactions to the things and people that interest you be, as much as possible, friendly rather than hostile.